Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where some of history's most important stories drift quietly beneath the surface, like wrecks on a seafloor, waiting for someone to slow down long enough to find them. Tonight, we're going to follow one of those stories down into the dark water. A ship that most people have never thought about, even though it was larger than the Titanic, even though it sank faster than the Titanic, and even though the question of exactly why it sank has never been fully, officially answered. Not after a century, not after dozens of dives, not after all the documents and the inquiries and the expeditions. The question is still there, sitting quietly at the bottom of the Aegean Sea, waiting. The ship was called the Britannic, and tonight we're going to spend some time with her. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere warm, tucked in with the lights low, maybe rain against the window, or a fan running softly in the corner? Or are you somewhere the night is cool and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you want to pull something close and just listen for a while? Whatever the answer, I am glad you're here. And if this kind of slow, careful storytelling is something you enjoy, I would be genuinely grateful if you like this video or subscribe to Life Beyond Scene. It helps this small, unhurried channel find more people who might want to sit with a story like this one. Now, make yourself comfortable. We have a long way to go, and there is no reason to rush. There is a particular kind of forgetting that history does to ships. The famous ones stay famous. The Titanic, of course, has never been forgotten. It has been written about, filmed, analysed and mourned for over 100 years, and it will probably be mourned for 100 more. But ships that fall just outside the circle of famous tragedy tend to disappear from the conversation almost entirely. They sink twice, in a way. Once into the sea, and once into the silence that surrounds everything that is not quite famous enough to keep people talking. The Britannic sank into both, and yet the Britannic was not a small ship. It was not an obscure vessel. It was the third of the three great Olympic-class ocean liners built by the White Star Line, the same company, the same shipyard, the same era that produced the Olympic and the Titanic. It was, in fact, the largest of the three. It was designed in the wake of one of the worst maritime disasters the world had ever seen, rebuilt from the lessons of that disaster, fitted with every improvement that engineers and naval architects could devise, and then it went to war, and it sank in 55 minutes, and 30 people died, and the cause of the explosion that started all of it has been debated ever since. 55 minutes. That is worth pausing on for a moment. The Titanic, which struck an iceberg and flooded through a long gash along its hull, took approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. The Britannic, which was larger, which had been specifically redesigned with better watertight compartments, which incorporated every safety lesson the maritime world had learned from the Titanic disaster, sank in less than an hour. That is not a small detail. That is the kind of detail that sits in your mind and refuses to leave quietly. The date was November 21st, 1916. The location was the Key Channel, a stretch of Aegean water between the Greek island of Kea and the Greek mainland, roughly 40 miles southeast of Athens. The Britannic was operating as a hospital ship, painted white with large red crosses on its hull and a green band running along its length. It was on its 6th voyage in that role, heading toward the island of Mudros to collect wounded soldiers from the ongoing campaigns of the First World War. It was doing exactly what a protected mercy vessel was supposed to do. And at 8 minutes past 8 in the morning, something exploded. That explosion, what caused it, what it means, and what it tells us about what the Britannic actually was in those final months of its life, is the question at the centre of everything we're going to talk about tonight. Now, the official explanation, the one that British authorities settled on after a relatively brief inquiry, is that the Britannic struck a mine, a moored contact mine, laid in the Key Channel by a German submarine some weeks earlier. That explanation is not unreasonable. There is real evidence behind it, but it is also not the whole story, and it has never fully satisfied everyone who has looked carefully at the evidence. A competing theory argues for a torpedo. And beneath both of those arguments runs a third, quieter, more uncomfortable question, one that the British government was not especially eager to examine in public during a war. The question of whether the Britannic was truly a hospital ship in every sense that international law required, or whether it was carrying something it should not have been. That question changes everything. Under the Geneva Convention, a hospital ship was a protected vessel. It could not be legally targeted, but that protection depended entirely on the ship carrying no war materials, no munitions, nothing that could be considered military cargo. If the Britannic was carrying something like that, the legal and moral picture shifts considerably. It becomes a different kind of story. Not a tragedy of an innocent mercy ship caught by an indiscriminate weapon, but something more complicated, something that wartime governments had every reason to leave unexamined. We do not know for certain. That is the honest answer, and it is one we will return to more than once tonight. What we do know is that the wreck of the Britannic rests today at approximately 120 metres of depth in the Key Channel, lying on its starboard side largely intact, enormous and quiet in the cold Aegean water. It was found in 1975 by the French oceanographer and explorer Jacques Cousteau, which is itself a remarkable footnote to a story that had been sitting in relative silence for nearly 60 years by that point. Cousteau's expedition filmed the wreck, documented its condition, and brought the Britannic back to public attention in a way it had not experienced since the sinking itself, and even then the attention did not last very long. The Titanic was rediscovered a decade later, in 1985, and the world's fascination rushed back to the more famous ship, leaving the Britannic once again in the shadow it has occupied for most of its existence. There is something quietly strange about that shadow. The Britannic was an extraordinary vessel. It was the product of one of the most dramatic periods in the history of ocean liner design, a period when the lessons of catastrophe were being translated directly into steel and rivets and rethought compartment walls. It carried nurses and doctors and orderlies across the Mediterranean during one of the most destructive wars in human history. It carried, among its crew, a woman named Violet Jessop, who had survived both the collision of the Olympic in 1911 and the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, and who would survive the Britannic as well, making her perhaps the most remarkable witness to the entire Olympic-class story. And it sank in a way that raised questions that have never been definitively closed. That is a lot of story for a ship that most people could not name if you asked them. Part of the reason the Britannic is forgotten is simply the timing. It sank in 1916, in the middle of a war that was consuming everything. The newspapers were full of battles, casualties, political crises, and the grinding misery of the Western Front. A hospital ship sinking in the Aegean, however large, however strange, was not the story of the year. It was not even the story of the week. The war had a way of absorbing disasters and moving on. The inquiry was brief, the questions were not pressed, the surviving crew were needed elsewhere, and the ship settled into the seafloor in the silence. The other part of the reason is the Titanic itself. The Titanic is so large in the popular imagination that it tends to swallow everything near it. Mention the Olympic class and people think of one ship. The Britannic becomes a footnote, a lesser echo, a ship that sank in the wrong war at the wrong time in the wrong part of the world to be remembered the way it perhaps deserves. But when you sit with the Britannic story carefully, when you follow the evidence and the arguments and the unanswered questions, it becomes clear that this is not a lesser story. It is a different story. One that involves the mechanics of wartime deception, the limits of international law, the behaviour of human beings under extraordinary pressure, and the stubborn refusal of a wreck to give up its last secrets, even after a century of diving and debating. There is also something almost melancholy about the Britannic's position in history. It was built to be a great ocean liner. It was designed for the North Atlantic passenger trade, for the Southampton to New York crossing, for the kind of grand, slow, luxurious voyage that the White Star Line had built its reputation on. It was never given that chance. It was requisitioned by the British military before it ever carried a single paying passenger. It went straight from its fitting out to its wartime service, and it never came back. It never got to be the ship it was supposed to be. That is the shape of the story we're going to follow tonight. A ship that never quite became itself, that served in a role it was not built for, that sank in a way that still has no fully agreed explanation, and that rests now in the Aegean, enormous and still, waiting for someone to look closely enough to understand it. And there is a great deal to understand. The design changes that were supposed to make it unsinkable, the wartime voyages across the Mediterranean, the explosion at 8:12 in the morning and the 55 minutes that followed, the mine theory and the torpedo theory, and the munitions question beneath both of them, the lifeboats that were lowered too early and the propellers that were still turning, the survivors and the inquiry and the long official silence, the wreck on its side in the cold water, and the divers who have spent decades trying to read what it can tell them. We will take all of it slowly. There is no need to rush. The Britannic has been waiting for over 100 years. It can wait a little longer while we build the picture properly. So let us start at the beginning. Before the war, before the hospital ship paint, before the explosion and the listing deck and the propellers rising out of the water. Let us start in Belfast in the years after the Titanic sank, when the shipbuilders at Harland and Wolff were looking at what had happened and trying to decide what to build differently. Because the Britannic was, in a very real sense, the Titanic's answer to itself. The ship that was supposed to prove that the lessons had been learned, and the story of what those lessons were, and how they were applied, and why they were not enough, begins with a keel being laid in a Belfast shipyard in the autumn of 1911. The keel for what would become the Britannic was laid down at Harland and Wolff's Queen's Island Yard in Belfast in November 1911, roughly 7 months after the Titanic had gone down in the North Atlantic. The timing was not coincidental. White Star Line needed a third ship to complete the Olympic-class trio, and the disaster had made it impossible to simply continue building as planned. The design had to change. The question was how much, and in what ways, and whether the changes would be enough. Thomas Andrews, the naval architect who had overseen much of the Titanic's design, and who had died on the ship himself, was of course gone. The loss of Andrews was not just personal. It was a genuine professional blow to Harland and Wolff. He had been one of the most capable ship designers working in Britain at the time, and his absence from the Britannic's development is one of those quiet historical ironies that tends to go unnoticed. The man who might have most wanted to apply the lessons of the Titanic was not alive to do it. Alexander Carlyle, who had been the chief draftsman and general manager at Harland and Wolff, and who had been involved in the earlier Olympic-class planning, had already left the company by 1911 over a disagreement about lifeboat provision, a detail that carries its own uncomfortable weight in hindsight. So the Britannic was shaped by men working under the shadow of a catastrophe, trying to correct for failures that had only recently become fully understood. The most significant structural change was the double hull. The Titanic had a double bottom, meaning the floor of the ship was built with 2 layers of steel separated by a gap of several feet, which provided some protection against flooding from below. The Britannic extended this double skin much further up the sides of the hull, to a height of about 5 feet above the waterline. This was a direct response to the way the Titanic had been damaged by a glancing blow from the iceberg along its starboard side, which had buckled or opened the hull plates in a long, relatively narrow line. A higher double skin would have made that kind of damage harder to inflict. Whether it would have saved the Titanic is debatable, but the principle was sound, and the engineers applied it as thoroughly as the design would allow. The watertight compartment system was also rethought. The Titanic had 15 transverse watertight bulkheads, but they did not extend all the way to the upper decks, which meant that once flooding reached a certain level, water could spill over the tops of the compartments and fill adjacent ones in a cascading sequence. The Britannic's bulkheads were designed to extend higher, and the compartments themselves were reconfigured to reduce this risk. The ship was calculated to remain afloat with 6 watertight compartments flooded, compared to the Titanic's 4. On paper, that was a meaningful improvement. It represented a genuine attempt to build a ship that could absorb more damage before losing the battle with buoyancy. Then there was the lifeboat system. This is perhaps the most visible of the post-Titanic changes, and in some ways the most dramatic. The Titanic had carried enough lifeboats for roughly half its maximum capacity, a figure that met the legal requirements of the time but was woefully inadequate in practice. The Britannic was fitted with a new type of davit, a large gantry davit system designed by the engineer William Whelan, which could swing out and lower multiple lifeboats from a single installation. Each gantry could handle boats from both sides of the ship, meaning that even if the ship listed severely to one side, and the boats on the high side became difficult to launch, the gantry system could theoretically still swing them out and lower them. The Britannic was equipped to carry 48 lifeboats in total, enough for everyone on board and then some. The system looked impressive. It was impressive in design terms. Whether it worked as well in the chaos of an actual sinking was a question that, as it turned out, would be answered sooner than anyone expected. The ship itself was enormous. At 882 feet in length and 48,158 gross tons, it was slightly larger than both the Olympic and the Titanic, which had been built to nearly identical dimensions. The extra tonnage came partly from the structural reinforcements and partly from adjustments to the superstructure. In terms of raw scale, the Britannic was the largest of the three, the culmination of the Olympic-class design rather than simply a copy of it. It had been planned with interior refinements as well, upgrades to the first-class accommodations that were intended to make it the most comfortable of the three ships. Grand staircase, reading rooms, dining saloons, the whole apparatus of Edwardian luxury ocean travel. None of that was ever seen by a paying passenger. The Britannic was launched on December 26, 1914, which was by that point already more than 4 months into the First World War. The date itself is worth noting. A ship launched on Boxing Day 1914 into a world that had already been at war long enough for the early optimism to have curdled into something grimmer. The North Atlantic passenger trade was not what it had been. German U-boats were operating in the Atlantic. Travel was dangerous and disrupted. The great liners were being converted or requisitioned. The commercial future the Britannic had been designed for was already uncertain. Fitting out continued through 1915, but White Star Line never got to put the ship into passenger service. In November 1915, the British government requisitioned the Britannic under the Defence of the Realm Act and converted it for use as a hospital ship. The conversion was done at the ship's own expense, which is to say, at the expense of White Star Line, and it involved the transformation of the passenger spaces into wards, operating theatres, and recovery areas. The grand first-class dining saloon became a ward. The cabins became medical spaces. The ship was repainted in the distinctive hospital ship scheme, a white hull with a broad green horizontal band running along the waterline and large red crosses on the sides and funnels, the international markings that were supposed to guarantee protection under the Geneva Convention. At its full capacity as a hospital ship, the Britannic could carry 3,309 patients. That is not a small number. It is roughly equivalent to a mid-sized general hospital, packed into a moving vessel crossing the Mediterranean. The ship was staffed by Royal Army Medical Corps personnel, nurses, doctors, orderlies, and the regular merchant marine crew who operated the ship itself. It was, by any measure, a serious and substantial medical operation, and the voyages it made between December 1915 and November 1916 were genuine humanitarian missions, transporting wounded soldiers from the theatres of war in the eastern Mediterranean back toward Britain. There is something almost vertiginous about the gap between what the Britannic was designed to be and what it became. The ship had been planned as the pinnacle of luxury ocean travel, the most refined expression of the White Star Line's ambition for the North Atlantic route. It had been designed with every comfort, every safety improvement, every lesson from the most famous maritime disaster in history built into its hull and its compartments and its lifeboat davits. and then it became a floating hospital, moving through a war zone, carrying men who'd been broken by artillery and gas and machine guns, ferrying them across a sea that was itself a theatre of submarine warfare. The distance between those two purposes is hard to fully hold in your mind. The irony that tends to get mentioned, and it genuinely is remarkable, is that the Britannic incorporated more safety features than any ship that had come before it, and it still sank faster than the Titanic. The Titanic took approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes to go under. The Britannic, with its higher double hull and its redesigned bulkheads and its improved compartmentalization, sank in 55 minutes. That fact has puzzled people for over a century, and it is one of the things that keeps the Britannic story alive in the minds of those who look at it carefully. The safety improvements were real, they were not cosmetic, and yet the ship went down faster. The explanation for that has to do with circumstances that no designer in Belfast in 1911 could have fully anticipated, and we will get to those circumstances in detail. But it is worth holding that number in mind as the background to everything that follows. 55 minutes. For a ship of that size, with those modifications, that is an extraordinary rate of loss. The 6 voyages the Britannic made as a hospital ship between December 1915 and November 1916 were largely uneventful in the sense that the ship completed them and returned safely. It operated on a route that ran from Southampton down through the Mediterranean, calling at ports including Naples and Augusta in Sicily, and proceeding east to Mudros, the large natural harbour on the Greek island of Lemnos that served as a major Allied base for operations in the eastern Mediterranean. The ship would load its wounded, turn around, and bring them back west. 6 voyages, thousands of patients transported. The work was unglamorous, exhausting, and necessary. By November 1916, the Britannic was on its 6th outward voyage, heading east toward Mudros to collect more casualties. It was not yet carrying patients on the outward leg. The medical staff was aboard, the crew was aboard, and the ship was moving at speed through the Kea Channel, a stretch of water between the Greek mainland and the island of Kea, also known as Zia in the Aegean. The morning of November 21st, 1916 was clear and relatively calm. The sea conditions were not severe, visibility was good. The ship was doing what it was supposed to do, in the place it was supposed to be, on a mission that was legally protected by international law. And at 8:12 in the morning, something exploded. That explosion, its cause, its consequences, and the 55 minutes that followed it, is the centre of the story. But to understand it properly, it helps to know what kind of ship the Britannic actually was when it entered that channel. Not just the technical specifications, but the human reality of it. The nurses who had been on it for multiple voyages, the crew who knew its rhythms and its spaces, the captain, Charles Bartlett, a steady and experienced officer who had commanded the ship since its requisitioning. The portholes that had been opened that morning for ventilation, because the ship had been running through warm Mediterranean air and the lower decks needed to breathe. All of those details matter. They all fed into what happened next. The Britannic that entered the Key Channel on the morning of November 21st was not just a set of hull dimensions and safety specifications. It was a working ship, a living system of people and procedures and small daily decisions, some of which, as it turned out, would prove to be the difference between survival and drowning. And the question of what caused the explosion that morning, whether it was a mine laid quietly in those waters weeks earlier, or something else entirely, is a question that has driven researchers and divers and historians for over a century without ever producing a fully agreed answer. What we do know is that the ship was there and that it was prepared and that it had been built with every precaution that the designers could think to include. And that when the moment came, 55 minutes was all it had. Among the people aboard the Britannic that morning was a woman named Violet Jessop. Her presence on that ship is one of those biographical details that sounds invented, the kind of coincidence a novelist would be advised against including because readers would find it too convenient. But there she was, a 30-year-old nurse serving with the British Red Cross, standing on the deck of the third Olympic-class vessel she had sailed on, in the third maritime incident of her career, about to survive for the third time. Her story runs through the entire Olympic-class narrative like a quiet thread, and it is worth following for a moment before we return to the morning of November 21st. Violet Jessop was born in Argentina in 1887, the daughter of Irish immigrants. Her family returned to Britain after her father died, and Violet eventually took work as a stewardess with the White Star Line, partly because the job paid reasonably well, and partly, by her own account, because she simply needed steady employment. She was young and dark-haired, and by all accounts composed under pressure in a way that would prove useful. Her first brush with Olympic-class disaster came in September 1911, when she was aboard the Olympic as it collided with the British Royal Navy cruiser HMS Hawke off the Isle of Wight. The collision caused significant damage to both vessels, but no fatalities. Violet came through it without injury and went back to work. Then came April 1912 and the Titanic. Violet was aboard as a first-class stewardess. When the ship struck the iceberg and the evacuation began, she was placed into lifeboat 16. She survived. She later recalled being handed a baby to hold in the lifeboat, a detail she included in her memoir with a kind of quiet bewilderment, noting that she never found out who the baby was or what became of it. She was rescued, she recovered, and within a few years she had signed on with the British Red Cross as a nurse, which is how she came to be aboard the Britannic in 1916. There is a temptation to treat Violet Jessop as primarily a symbol, the woman who survived 3 disasters, Miss Unsinkable, as she has sometimes been called. But her actual accounts of those events are more useful than the nickname suggests. She was an observer. She was present for things that other survivors did not witness or did not record. And her memoir, written late in life and published posthumously in 1997, contains details about the Britannic sinking that add texture to the bare facts. She described the explosion as sudden and violent, a sound and a sensation that she said felt different from anything she had experienced before. She described the listing of the ship beginning almost immediately. She described the chaos that followed on deck as the crew and medical staff tried to organise an evacuation from a vessel that was already tilting and still moving through the water. She also described something that has stayed with historians who study the sinking. She described jumping into the sea as the ship went under and being pulled down, sucked beneath the surface by the movement of the water, and then surfacing. She recalled hitting her head on something underwater, which she believed was the keel of a lifeboat, and which left her with a lasting headache that she mentioned with a kind of dry matter-of-factness. She swam, she was picked up, she survived. She was 30 years old. She would live to be 83, and she spent most of the rest of her life working as a stewardess on various ships, because it was the job she knew, and in some ways seemed to love despite everything. She retired in 1950 and died in Suffolk in 1971. What her presence on the Britannic reminds us is that the ship was not an abstraction. It was full of people with histories and habits and reasons for being there. The medical staff had, in many cases, been making these voyages for months. They knew the ship's routines. They knew which decks got warm in the mornings. They knew Captain Bartlett's style of command. They knew the route through the Key Channel because they had travelled it before. The Britannic was not an unfamiliar environment to the people aboard it on November 21st. It was, in the way that working ships become, something like home. Captain Charles Bartlett was 54 years old and had been commanding vessels for decades. He was known within the White Star Line as a careful and experienced officer, not a flashy figure, not the kind of captain whose name appears in society columns, but exactly the sort of man you would want in charge of a hospital ship moving through contested waters in wartime. He had taken command of the Britannic when it was requisitioned in November 1915, and he had brought it through 5 previous voyages without incident. On the morning of the 6th voyage's outward leg, he was on the bridge, and the ship was making good speed through the Key Channel. The Key Channel, also called the Douro Channel in some accounts, is a stretch of water roughly 30 miles long and between 5 and 10 miles wide, running between the island of Kea to the west and the Greek mainland to the east. In November 1916, Greece was officially neutral, though its neutrality was complicated and contested by the pressures of the war around it. The channel was a standard route for Allied shipping in the eastern Mediterranean. It was not considered a particularly dangerous stretch of water, in the sense of being storm-prone or navigationally difficult. It was, however, a stretch of water that a German submarine had visited in late October 1916. The submarine was U-73, commanded by Kapitän-Leutnant Gustav Siess. U-73 was a mine-laying submarine, one of a class of vessels specifically designed to plant moored contact mines in shipping lanes, rather than to attack ships directly with torpedoes. In late October 1916, U-73 had passed through the Key Channel and laid a field of mines, anchored to the seabed by cables, floating at a depth calculated to catch the hulls of passing ships. The mines were spherical, roughly the size of a large barrel, studded with detonating horns that would trigger the explosive charge on contact. They were not visible from the surface. They were patient. They waited. Other ships had already encountered them. The French armed cruiser Beur de Gala struck a mine in the same general area on November 14, 1916, and sank. The transport Bremer Castle struck a mine on November 23rd, 2 days after the Britannic, and was damaged but not lost. These incidents, bracketing the Britannic disaster, form part of the documented record of U-73's mine-laying activity in that area. The German naval records, though incomplete in places, corroborate the presence of mines in the Key Channel during that period. At 8:12 in the morning on November 21st, the Britannic struck something. The explosion occurred on the starboard side, near the bow in the area of holds 2 and 3. The ship shuddered. The sound was described by survivors as a deep, hollow detonation, different in character from an internal explosion, though survivors' accounts of such things are notoriously difficult to interpret with precision. The immediate effect was flooding in the forward section of the ship, and the ship began to list to starboard almost at once. Captain Bartlett responded quickly. He ordered the watertight doors closed, which was the correct immediate response. He also made a decision that has been debated ever since. He ordered the engines kept running and attempted to steer the Britannic toward the coast of Kea Island, roughly 3 miles away, with the intention of beaching the ship before it sank. The logic was sound. If he could get the hull onto the shallow water near the island, the ship might not sink completely, and the evacuation would be far less dangerous than abandoning a sinking vessel in open water. The problem was that the ship was already flooding faster than the closed watertight doors could contain, and the reason for that connects directly to those open portholes. Hospital ships in warm climates opened their lower deck portholes and gangway doors for ventilation as a matter of standard practice. It made the wards more bearable for patients, and on the outward leg with no patients aboard, it was simply a matter of keeping the lower decks comfortable for the staff. The portholes on the Britannic's E deck and F deck had been opened that morning. As the ship listed to starboard and the bow dipped, water began entering through those openings at a rate that the watertight compartment system had not been designed to handle. The safety improvements were real, but they had been designed to compensate for flooding through the hull, not through open windows. The water came in faster than the pumps could manage, faster than the compartments could isolate. There is something almost unbearably ordinary about that detail. Open portholes on a warm morning, a routine precaution that had been taken on every previous voyage. Nobody had done anything wrong. The ship had done everything it was supposed to do, and one small, sensible, unremarkable decision about ventilation became a catastrophic vulnerability in the space of a few minutes. The Britannic continued moving, listing steadily, the bow sinking, the stern beginning to rise. And then the propellers came out of the water. 2 lifeboats had been lowered prematurely on the starboard side. Who gave the order, or whether anyone gave a formal order at all, is not entirely clear from the surviving accounts. In the confusion of an evacuation from a rapidly listing ship, with officers shouting across decks and the noise of water and machinery and frightened people. It is possible that the boats were lowered by crew members acting on their own initiative, believing the ship was about to go under faster than it did. Whatever the reason, the boats went down while the Britannic was still moving at speed, and the propellers, rising out of the water as the stern lifted, pulled the boats in. The accounts of what happened are grim and brief. Around 28 to 30 people were killed, most of them in those two lifeboats. They represent nearly the entire death toll of the sinking. The ship carried 1,066 people that morning. 30 died. That survival rate is, by any measure, extraordinary. The Titanic, which took more than twice as long to sink, lost more than 1,500 people. The Britannic, sinking in 55 minutes, lost 30. The difference comes down to several factors: the calm weather, the proximity of rescue vessels, the experience of the crew, the relatively small number of people aboard compared to the ship's capacity, and the fact that the ship went down in daylight in a known shipping lane rather than in the middle of the North Atlantic at night. But the survival rate is still striking, and it has sometimes been used as an argument against the idea that anything particularly sinister was happening aboard the ship. A vessel secretly carrying munitions, the argument goes, might have expected a more violent secondary explosion and a higher death toll. The fact that most people got off alive suggests to some a more straightforward disaster. The Britannic sank at 9:07 in the morning. From the explosion to the final disappearance beneath the surface, 55 minutes had passed. Rescue came from nearby vessels, including the destroyer HMS Scourge and several Greek fishing boats operating in the channel. The survivors were taken to the island of Kea and later transported to Athens and eventually back to Britain. Violet Jessop was among them. Captain Bartlett survived. The ship did not. What the Britannic was doing in those 55 minutes, and what caused them, is the question that has driven the story ever since. The mine theory, which is the official explanation and the most widely accepted one, is supported by solid evidence. The documented mine-laying activity of U-73, the sinking of the Burdigala 2 weeks earlier, the damage to the Braemar Castle 2 days later, the location of the explosion consistent with a mine strike on the starboard bow. It is a coherent account. It fits the known facts. But it does not fully explain the speed and extent of the flooding, and it does not settle every question about what the Britannic was actually carrying when it entered the Key Channel that morning. Because there is another possibility that has circled the story for over a century, one that the British government was not eager to examine too closely in 1916, one that the brief official inquiry did not pursue with any great energy, and one that a small number of serious researchers have continued to raise in the decades since. The question of whether the Britannic, a ship protected by the Geneva Convention, a ship painted white with red crosses, was secretly carrying something it should not have been carrying. And if it was, then the question of what it legally was changes in ways that matter. That question does not have a clean answer. It may never have one. But understanding why it has persisted, what evidence exists on either side, and why the British government's wartime records on the subject remain incomplete, is the next part of the story. But before we get to that question, it is worth staying with the sinking itself a little longer, because the sequence of events on the morning of November 21st, 1916, is more complicated and more interesting than a simple summary allows. And understanding exactly what happened in those 55 minutes is the only way to understand why the questions that followed have never fully gone away. The explosion occurred at 8:12 in the morning. The Britannic was moving through the Key Channel at around 21 knots, which is a meaningful detail. That is a fast pace for a large vessel in a relatively confined stretch of water. The ship was on its outward leg, heading toward Mudros to collect wounded soldiers, so it had no patients aboard. The crew and medical staff numbered just over 1,000 people. The morning was calm, the sea was flat, the visibility was good. By the standards of a wartime voyage in the Aegean, it was an unremarkable morning. The explosion hit on the starboard side, somewhere in the area of the forward holds, between holds 2 and 3 by most accounts. The sound and force of it were described by survivors as a single sharp detonation, not a prolonged series of blasts. The ship shuddered. Dishes fell in the galley. People were thrown off their feet in the lower corridors. On deck, the shock was felt through the hull rather than heard clearly, the way a large impact transmits itself through metal before the sound catches up. Within seconds, it was obvious that something serious had happened. The bow began to settle. The list to starboard was almost immediate. Captain Charles Bartlett was on the bridge. He was an experienced officer, and his response in the first minutes was composed and methodical. He ordered the watertight doors closed. He assessed the situation as best he could from the information reaching him, and then he made a decision that is still debated by people who study the sinking. He decided to try to beach the ship on the island of Kea, which was roughly 3 miles away to the northeast. He kept the engines running and turned the Britannic toward shore. On its face, this seems like a reasonable decision. 3 miles is not a great distance. If the ship could be run aground in shallow water, even if it sank, it would sink in conditions where survivors could wade or swim to safety and where rescue would be straightforward. The logic of beaching a damaged vessel is sound, and it has saved lives in other maritime disasters. Bartlett had reason to believe it might work here. The problem was speed. To reach the beach in time, the ship had to keep moving, which meant the engines had to keep turning, which meant the propellers kept turning. And as the bow sank lower and the stern rose, the propellers began to lift out of the water. A ship's propellers, when they breach the surface while still spinning, become enormously dangerous to anything in the water nearby. The suction and the turbulence they create can pull objects toward them from a considerable distance. The blades themselves, each one the size of a small room on a ship this large, move with enough force to destroy a wooden lifeboat instantly. The evacuation had begun almost immediately after the explosion. The order to abandon ship was given, and crew members began preparing the lifeboats. The new davit system, one of the post-Titanic improvements, was designed to swing out and lower boats quickly, even if the ship was listing. On paper, it was an improvement over the older systems. In practice, under the conditions of an actual emergency on a listing moving ship, it was harder to control than the drills had suggested. On the starboard side, which was the lower side due to the list, 2 lifeboats were put into the water before the ship had slowed or stopped. The accounts differ slightly on exactly how this happened. Some survivors describe crew members acting on their own initiative, believing the ship was going down faster than it was. Others suggested there was confusion about orders, that instructions were misheard or misunderstood in the noise and chaos of the evacuation. What is clear is that the boats went into the water while the Britannic was still making significant headway, and the propellers rising out of the sea as the stern lifted were still turning. The boats were pulled in. The propellers did what physics required them to do. The people in those boats, somewhere between 28 and 30 of them depending on the account, had no warning and no time. It was over very quickly. Violet Jessup, who had already survived the Titanic, was in the water by this point, having jumped from the ship, and she described being pulled under by the suction of the propellers before resurfacing. She struck her head on something underwater, hard enough that she later discovered she had cracked her skull, though she did not know it at the time. She was pulled into a lifeboat and survived. Others in the water around her did not. Bartlett eventually cut the engines when it became clear that the ship was not going to make the beach, and that the propellers were killing people. By then the damage was done. The Britannic continued its final minutes without power, the bow pulling steadily downward, the stern rising at an increasingly steep angle. People in the water and in lifeboats watched the stern climb into the morning air. The funnels, the enormous 4 funnels that were one of the most recognisable features of the Olympic-class ships, began to fall as the angle became too steep for their supports. The sound of a ship breaking apart and flooding in its final minutes is something that survivors described in terms of groaning and crashing, and a kind of deep structural noise that is hard to put into words if you have never heard anything like it. At 9:07 in the morning, the Britannic went under. 55 minutes after the explosion, the sea closed over it. The rescue was relatively swift by the standards of the era and the location. HMS Scourge, a destroyer, was in the area and responded. Several Greek fishing vessels working in the channel came to help. The weather remained calm, which made the rescue far easier than it might have been. Most of the survivors were in lifeboats or clinging to debris within a manageable area. The island of Kea was close enough that some people swam to it. By the standards of a wartime sinking of a large vessel, the rescue operation went well. But 30 people did not come home, and 28 or so of them died not because the ship sank, but because 2 lifeboats were lowered at the wrong moment. That is a specific and uncomfortable fact. The ship sank in 55 minutes, and most people survived. The propellers killed nearly as many people as the explosion and the flooding combined. Whether that outcome was the result of a single bad decision, a cascade of miscommunications, or simply the chaos that attends any emergency of that scale, is not a question with a clean answer. What it does suggest is that the new lifeboat davit system, for all its engineering improvements, had not fully solved the human problem of coordinating an evacuation under pressure. There is also the question of what Bartlett's decision to beach the ship actually cost. If he had cut the engines immediately and ordered a full stop, the propellers would have slowed and eventually stopped before they rose out of the water. The ship might still have sunk, probably would have, but the 2 lifeboats might have survived. On the other hand, if the beaching had worked, the ship might have gone down in shallow water, and the evacuation would have been even safer than it was. Bartlett was making decisions in real time with incomplete information, under enormous pressure, in a situation that was changing faster than any plan could accommodate. It is easy to look back and identify the moment where a different choice might have changed the outcome. It is much harder to say with any confidence that you would have made that different choice in the same position. The inquiry that followed the sinking did not dwell extensively on these questions. The British government's investigation was brief, focused primarily on the cause of the explosion rather than the conduct of the evacuation, and it reached its conclusions quickly. The mine theory was accepted. The war was ongoing. There were larger things to attend to. The Britannic story was noted, filed, and largely set aside. What the inquiry did establish, or rather what it accepted without deep scrutiny, was the sequence of flooding. The watertight compartments had been compromised not just by the initial explosion, but by the open portholes and gangway doors. The flooding had spread laterally through the ship in ways that the compartment design had not fully anticipated. The post-Titanic improvements had been real and meaningful, but they had been designed around a specific set of failure conditions, and the open portholes introduced a different failure condition that the designers had not prioritized. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The Britannic was, by every measure, a safer ship than the Titanic. Its watertight compartments were better. Its lifeboat capacity was vastly superior. Its double hull extended higher along the sides. The lessons of April 1912 had been studied, debated, and incorporated into the design, and yet it sank faster. Not because the improvements failed exactly, but because the circumstances of its sinking introduced a variable that the improvements had not been built to handle. The open portholes were not a design flaw. They were a reasonable operational practice for a hospital ship in warm waters. The safety systems were not inadequate. They were simply not designed to compensate for flooding through ventilation openings on multiple decks simultaneously. The speed of the sinking is the detail that has driven speculation for over a century. 55 minutes is fast. The Titanic, which struck an iceberg and sustained damage along a much longer section of its hull, took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. The Britannic, with the benefit of every lesson learned from that disaster, sank in less than a third of the time. The mine theory accounts for the initial explosion. The open portholes account for much of the flooding rate. But some researchers have looked at the combination of speed and extent of the flooding, and suggested that something more was happening inside the ship than a mine strike alone would explain. The idea of a secondary explosion, something inside the ship that detonated after the initial blast and accelerated the flooding, is one of the more persistent threads in the alternative accounts. A secondary explosion would not necessarily have been heard or felt distinctly by survivors. In the noise and chaos of a ship in distress, a secondary detonation in a forward hold might have been absorbed into the general din of flooding and structural failure. The survivors' accounts are detailed in some respects and vague in others, which is entirely normal for people who are frightened, in motion, and focused on survival rather than documentation. What a secondary explosion would require is something inside the ship capable of detonating, and that is where the story begins to move from the mechanics of the sinking toward the much more uncomfortable question of what the Britannic was actually carrying. The official manifest said medical supplies. The Geneva Convention required it to carry nothing else. But the official manifest and the actual contents of a wartime vessel's holds are not always the same document, and the circumstances of 1916 were not circumstances in which transparency was always the highest priority. That question, the cargo question, is the one that the brief official inquiry sidestepped most visibly. It is the one that some researchers have spent years trying to answer, using declassified records, wreck surveys, and careful analysis of the British government's wartime logistics. It is also the one that the wreck itself, lying on its starboard side in 120 metres of Aegean water, has so far declined to answer definitively. The bow section, where the explosion occurred, is the most damaged part of the wreck and the most difficult to examine. Whatever was in holds 2 and 3 on the morning of November 21st, 1916, has had more than a century of seawater and sediment to obscure the evidence. The mine theory remains the most widely accepted explanation, and it is not wrong to accept it. The documented activity of U-73 in the Key Channel, the sinking of the Burdigala 2 weeks before and the Braemar Castle 2 days after, the location and nature of the explosion, all of it fits a mine strike with reasonable consistency. But the speed of the sinking, the extent of the flooding, and the questions about the cargo have kept a second set of explanations alive alongside the official one. And understanding those alternative explanations, what evidence supports them, where they are strong, and where they strain against the known facts, requires looking more carefully at what U-73 actually did in October 1916, and at what the German naval records from that period do and do not confirm. So let us start with what U-73 actually was, and what it was doing in the Eastern Mediterranean in the autumn of 1916. U-73 was a German mine-laying submarine, commissioned in 1915. It was not a large vessel by the standards of the war, but it was specifically designed for a particular kind of quiet, patient destruction. Rather than hunting ships directly with torpedoes, a mine-laying submarine would navigate into a strategic channel or shipping lane, deploy a field of contact mines at a calculated depth, and then leave. The mines would wait, days, weeks, sometimes months. The submarine would be long gone by the time anything struck one. It is a method of warfare that is almost impersonal in its patience. The weapon does not pursue its target. The target comes to the weapon. Captain Lieutenant Gustav CS commanded U-73 during its most consequential deployment. In late October 1916, CS brought his submarine into the Keir Channel, a stretch of water between the Greek mainland and the island of Keir, also known as Zia, which sits roughly 35 nautical miles southeast of Athens. The channel was a natural bottleneck. Allied ships moving between the Western Mediterranean and the Aegean passed through it regularly. It was, from a German strategic perspective, an obvious place to lay a trap. U-73 deployed a minefield in the Key Channel, sometime around October 28, 1916. The exact positions of the individual mines were not broadcast to the Allies, for obvious reasons, and the German records of the precise mine-laying pattern were not fully available to British investigators after the war. What was documented was the result. In the weeks that followed, 3 ships were sunk or badly damaged in that channel, in circumstances consistent with mine strikes from U-73's deployment, The first was the French armoured cruiser Burdigala, which sank on November 14, 1916, in the Kia Channel. 22 men died. The Burdigala had been requisitioned for troop transport, and its loss was attributed to a mine. The second was the Britannic, 7 days later. The third was the British transport Braemar Castle, which struck a mine in the same general area on November 23, 1916, though it managed to beach itself and was eventually salvaged. 3 ships, 9 days, the same stretch of water. The pattern is not subtle. Contact mines of the Type U-73 deployed operated on a straightforward mechanical principle. Each mine was a roughly spherical steel casing, typically around a metre in diameter, filled with a charge of explosive, usually TNT or a similar compound. The mine was attached by a cable to a heavy anchor on the seabed, which held it at a preset depth below the surface, deep enough not to be visible from a passing ship but shallow enough to intersect a vessel's hull. The outer casing was fitted with several protruding horns, small lead tubes containing an electrolyte solution. When a ship's hull struck one of these horns and bent it, the electrolyte was released, completing a circuit that detonated the main charge. The explosion was not a shaped charge designed to penetrate armour. It was a pressure blast, a sudden release of energy that could rupture hull plating, collapse bulkheads, and send a shockwave through the water and the ship simultaneously. Against a warship with heavy armour, a single mine might cause serious but survivable damage. Against a large but lightly built vessel like a hospital ship or a transport, the effect could be catastrophic. The Britannic's hull, while well constructed and incorporating the post-Titanic double hull extension, was not armoured in any military sense. It was a passenger liner adapted for medical service. The steel was thick by merchant standards, but it was not designed to absorb the kind of energy a mine delivered. The explosion that struck the Britannic at 8:12 a.m. on November 21st hit the starboard side near the bow, in the region of holds 2 and 3. The physical characteristics of that explosion, as described by survivors and later analysed by investigators, are consistent with a mine strike in several important respects. The blast came from outside the hull, which is what a mine would produce. There was a single primary detonation rather than the multiple successive impacts you might expect from a torpedo that struck, and then the warhead detonated. The location was close to the waterline, which is where a moored mine set at standard depth would make contact with a ship of the Britannic's draft. And the key channel had a documented minefield laid by a documented submarine. The chain of evidence, while not forensically perfect, holds together with reasonable coherence. After the war, when German naval records became partially accessible, the British Admiralty reviewed what was available. Sea's and U-73's mine-laying activities in the Key Channel in late October 1916 were confirmed in German records. The Burdigala sinking had already been attributed to U-73's mines by French investigators. The pattern of the Britannic's sinking in the same channel, at a depth and location consistent with a moored contact mine, aligned with that attribution. The British inquiry had concluded mine strike before the war even ended, and the post-war review of German records did nothing to contradict that conclusion. It is worth saying clearly, the mine theory is not a convenient story invented to avoid difficult questions. It is supported by documented submarine activity, by the sinking of 2 other ships in the same location within 9 days, by the physical characteristics of the explosion as described by witnesses, and by the location and depth of the blast. If you were asked to evaluate the mine theory on its own terms, without any competing hypothesis, you would find it persuasive. It fits the known facts without requiring any assumptions that strain credibility. What it does not fully explain, and this is where the mine theory begins to encounter its limits, is the speed and extent of the flooding that followed. A moored contact mine of the type U-73 deployed would have delivered a powerful but localised explosion. The damage would have been concentrated in the immediate area of the blast. Hull plating would have been ruptured, frames bent, possibly a bulkhead or 2 compromised. Flooding would have begun immediately and would have been serious. But the Britannic's watertight compartment system, even with the open portholes factored in, should have been able to contain that flooding long enough for a slower, more controlled sinking. The open portholes accelerated things considerably, and that is not a minor factor. But 55 minutes is still very fast for a ship that size with those safety features, even accounting for the ventilation openings. Naval engineers and maritime historians who have looked carefully at the Britannic's sinking have generally concluded that the open portholes are the primary explanation for the speed of the flooding, and that the mine theory does not require any additional assumptions to remain valid. The flooding spread through the lower decks via the open portholes faster than the watertight doors could compensate. The list developed quickly, and the ship's trim changed so rapidly that the situation became unrecoverable within the first 15 minutes. That is a plausible sequence. It is not impossible. But there is a detail that has made some researchers hesitant to fully close the file on the mine theory as a complete explanation, and it has to do with the behaviour of the flooding in the first minutes after the explosion. Several survivors described the flooding as having a sudden, almost simultaneous quality across multiple sections of the bow, rather than the progressive spread you might expect from a single rupture point. A mine strike on the outer hull should have created one primary breach, with flooding spreading outward from that point. Some accounts suggest the flooding felt more immediate and widespread than that single-point breach model would predict. This is where the torpedo theory enters the conversation, not as a certainty but as a genuine alternative that some researchers have found more consistent with the flooding pattern. A torpedo, unlike a mine, is a directed weapon. It is designed to penetrate the hull before its warhead detonates, driving the explosion deeper into the ship's structure and maximising the internal damage. A torpedo strike typically causes more widespread structural failure than a mine strike of equivalent explosive weight, because the energy is delivered inside or against the inner hull, rather than against the outer plating. If the Britannic was struck by a torpedo rather than a mine, the flooding pattern, the speed of the sinking, and the extent of the structural damage might all be more readily explained. The torpedo theory also intersects with the German records in an interesting way. U-73 was a mine layer, not a standard attack submarine, though it did carry torpedoes as a secondary armament. Whether CS fired a torpedo at the Britannic in addition to, or instead of, the ship striking one of his mines is something the German records do not clearly resolve. U-73's war diary for that period was either incomplete, lost, or ambiguous on the specific question of whether a torpedo was fired in the Key Channel on November 21st. The absence of a clear record is not the same as evidence that a torpedo was fired, but it is also not the same as evidence that one was not. Some naval historians have pointed out that the German Naval Command had limited incentive to record a torpedo attack on a hospital ship with any clarity. Attacking a clearly marked hospital ship with a torpedo would have been a violation of international law, a propaganda disaster if confirmed, and a diplomatic liability. A mine strike, by contrast, was legally and strategically defensible. A mine does not discriminate between targets. It sits in a channel and waits. If a hospital ship enters a mined channel without being warned, the responsibility for that outcome is at least partially shared. A torpedo attack on a hospital ship, however, is a deliberate act against a protected vessel. The incentive to record one clearly in official logs would have been, to put it gently, rather low. This is not to say the torpedo theory is proven, it is not. The mine theory remains the official and most widely accepted explanation, and the evidence for U-73's mine-laying activity in the Key Channel is solid. But the torpedo theory is not simply a fringe idea or a conspiracy. It has been seriously examined by researchers who have looked at the wreck, the German records, and the physical evidence of the sinking, and some of them have concluded that the torpedo remains a credible alternative. The difficulty in resolving the question definitively comes down, in the end, to the wreck itself. The section of the Britannic most relevant to answering the mine versus torpedo question is the starboard bow, the area of holds 2 and 3 where the explosion occurred. That section of the wreck is the most heavily damaged, the most deeply buried in sediment, and the most difficult to examine. The Britannic lies on its starboard side, which means the very part of the hull that would carry the clearest physical evidence of what struck it is pressed against the seabed. Accessing that section for forensic examination would require significant excavation and a level of technical complexity that no expedition has yet achieved. What can be observed from outside the wreck, and what has been observed by Cousteau's team, by Robert Ballard's 1995 expedition, and by subsequent technical diving surveys, is the general pattern of damage in the bow area. The damage is consistent with a large external explosion. Beyond that general observation, the wreck has not offered a clean answer. The bow plating has collapsed and distorted in ways that could be consistent with either a mine or a torpedo, and without access to the interior of that section, the two explanations remain difficult to distinguish from the outside, so the mine theory stands. It is well supported, logically coherent, and consistent with the documented evidence. U-73 laid a minefield in the Key Channel. Other ships were sunk by those mines. The Britannic's explosion fits the profile of a mine strike. The open portholes explain a significant portion of the flooding speed. The official inquiry reached a reasonable conclusion given the information available, and yet the torpedo theory does not disappear. It keeps returning because the flooding was very fast, the German records are not fully transparent, and the most important part of the wreck cannot yet be examined closely enough to settle the question. The two theories have coexisted for over a century, and they are likely to continue coexisting until the bow section of the Britannic can be properly surveyed, which may require technology and access that does not yet exist. What makes this particular debate interesting, beyond the historical and forensic dimensions, is that it is not merely academic. Whether the Britannic struck a mine or was hit by a torpedo matters for a reason that goes well beyond the mechanics of the sinking. It matters because of what a torpedo attack would imply. A torpedo is a deliberate aimed weapon. Firing a torpedo at a clearly marked hospital ship is not an accident of geography. It is a decision. And if that decision was made, it was made for a reason. And the most obvious reason a German submarine commander might have had for targeting a hospital ship in 1916 is if he had reason to believe it was not only a hospital ship. That possibility, the idea that the Britannic might have been carrying something other than what its red crosses and white paint declared, is the thread that connects the mine versus torpedo debate to a much more uncomfortable question about what the ship actually was on the morning it sank. The munitions question, as it has come to be known, is the part of the Britannic story that the official inquiry was least eager to examine. And it is the part that some researchers have spent the most time trying to answer, with results that are, to put it carefully, inconclusive but not dismissible. The torpedo theory, then, is not simply a competing explanation that sits alongside the mine theory in polite disagreement. It is a theory that, if true, changes the meaning of the whole event. And the people who have taken it most seriously have done so not because they enjoy controversy, but because the physical evidence of how the Britannic sank has never quite sat comfortably inside the mine explanation alone. To understand why, it helps to think about what a contact mine actually does to a ship. A moored contact mine of the type U-73 was deploying in 1916 was essentially a steel sphere, roughly a metre or so in diameter, filled with a charge of TNT or similar explosive, anchored to the seabed by a cable, and floating at a predetermined depth just below the surface. When a ship's hull made contact with the protruding detonating horns on the sphere's surface, it triggered the charge. The resulting explosion was powerful, certainly powerful enough to breach a hull and cause serious flooding, but it was, in most cases, a localized event. The blast occurred at a single point of contact, punching a hole or rupturing plates in a defined area. Ships struck by mines in the First World War typically flooded through that breach, and the rate of flooding depended heavily on the size of the breach, the ship's internal compartmentalization, and how quickly the crew could isolate the damaged section. A torpedo was a different matter. A torpedo of that era was a self-propelled underwater weapon, carrying a warhead of roughly 150 to 200 kilograms of explosive, designed to strike a ship's hull at speed and detonate on impact. The energy delivered by a torpedo strike was generally more concentrated and more violent than a mine strike, and the damage pattern was often different. A torpedo tended to blow inward, collapsing or rupturing a larger section of hull plating, and the flooding that followed could be faster and more difficult to contain. The distinction is not absolute. A very large mine could cause catastrophic flooding, and a torpedo could, in certain circumstances, cause relatively contained damage. But in general terms, the two weapons left different signatures on a hull, and those signatures, at least in theory, should be distinguishable from each other. The argument made by researchers who favour the torpedo theory is essentially this. The Britannic sank in 55 minutes. It was a ship of nearly 50,000 gross tons, equipped with improved watertight compartmentalisation, specifically designed after the Titanic disaster. Even with the open portholes accelerating the flooding, the speed of the sinking has struck some analysts as difficult to fully account for with a single mine strike, even a large one. The open portholes undeniably made things worse, and this is not a small factor. Gangway doors and ventilation openings along the lower decks, left open as standard practice on a hospital ship in mild weather, would have allowed seawater to enter the hull through multiple points as the bow dipped. This is well documented and widely accepted, but the question some researchers have asked is whether the open portholes alone are sufficient to explain everything, or whether the initial explosion was simply larger and more destructive than a typical mine strike would produce. Roy Watling, a researcher who examined the wreck data and the historical record in some detail, is among those who have argued that the damage profile of the Britannic is more consistent with a torpedo than a mine. His argument centres partly on the speed and extent of the initial flooding, and partly on the character of the explosion as described by survivors. Several witnesses described a sharp, violent detonation, followed almost immediately by a second, smaller disturbance, which some have interpreted as a secondary event inside the ship, and others have attributed to the mechanics of the initial explosion propagating through the hull. Witness accounts of explosions are notoriously unreliable in the technical sense, because the experience of being near a large underwater detonation is disorienting, and the human mind is not well equipped to distinguish precisely between a single complex event and two separate events occurring close together. But the consistency of some accounts in describing a particularly violent initial blast has contributed to the view that what struck the Britannic may have been something more energetic than a standard moored mine. There is also the question of the German records, and this is where the torpedo theory draws some of its most persistent support. U-73 was not exclusively a mine layer. It was a submarine capable of firing torpedoes, and Kapitänleutnant Gustav CS was an experienced commander who had been operating in the Mediterranean for some time. The question of whether CS fired a torpedo at the Britannic on the morning of November 21, 1916, cannot be answered from the German war diary with any certainty, because the relevant records are either missing, incomplete, or ambiguous. This has been confirmed by multiple researchers who have examined the German naval archives. Whether that ambiguity is the result of wartime record-keeping practices, deliberate omission, or simple administrative loss is not known. What is known is that the German Naval Command in 1916 was navigating a complicated diplomatic situation regarding submarine warfare. Unrestricted submarine warfare, the policy of attacking any ship in a designated war zone without warning, had been suspended and reinstated at various points during the war in response to international pressure, particularly from the United States following incidents like the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. In November 1916, Germany was operating under a modified form of submarine warfare that placed restrictions on attacks against clearly identified hospital ships. A German submarine commander who torpedoed a properly marked hospital ship in broad daylight would have been creating a serious problem for his government. The incentive to record such an action honestly in an official log was, as mentioned, rather low. This does not prove that a torpedo was fired. The absence of a clear record is simply an absence of a record. But it does mean that the German documentation cannot be used to definitively rule out a torpedo attack, which is a different thing from it being evidence that one occurred. The wreck itself is the place where this question should ultimately be answerable, and the frustrating reality is that the wreck has not yet provided a clean answer. The Britannic lies on its starboard side in approximately 120 metres of water in the Key Channel. The ship is largely intact from roughly amidships to the stern, which is one of the things that makes it so remarkable compared to the Titanic, which broke apart on the surface and now lies in two major pieces with a vast debris field between them. But the bow section of the Britannic, the area of holds 2 and 3 where the explosion occurred, is a different story. It is the most heavily damaged part of the wreck, collapsed and distorted, and it is also the section most deeply buried in the sediment of the seabed. The starboard side of the bow, which would carry the most direct physical evidence of what struck the ship, is pressed against the bottom. Reaching it, examining it, and interpreting what is found there would require significant excavation and a level of technical and logistical complexity that no expedition has yet been in a position to undertake. What the various expeditions to the wreck have been able to observe from outside is a general pattern of outward displaced plating in the bow area, which is consistent with an external explosion rather than an internal one. This is useful information. It tells researchers that the initial event was something that detonated outside the hull and drove force inward, which is consistent with both a mine and a torpedo. Beyond that general observation, the external view of the bow has not been able to distinguish between the two. The damage is collapsed and layered in ways that make forensic interpretation from the outside genuinely difficult, and the sediment covering the lower starboard bow makes the most critical section of the hull essentially invisible without excavation. This is not for lack of effort or interest. The Britannic has been visited by Cousteau's team in 1975, by Robert Ballard's expedition in 1995, and by a number of technical diving surveys in the year since. Each expedition has added to the general picture of the wreck's condition, and contributed observations about the open portholes, the divot positions, the state of the hull plating in various sections, and the overall orientation of the ship on the seabed. But none of them has been able to get close enough to the right part of the bow to answer the mine versus torpedo question with any finality. The wreck is protected as a war grave under Greek law, which adds an additional layer of legal and ethical complexity to any proposal for excavation or invasive examination. So the torpedo theory continues to exist alongside the mine theory, neither proven nor disproven, sustained by the speed of the sinking, the ambiguity of the German records, and the inaccessibility of the most relevant part of the wreck. It is a theory that serious researchers take seriously, not because they are looking for drama, but because the evidence genuinely does not close the door on it. And the reason this matters, as noted, is not simply a question of which weapon was used. It is a question of what the use of a torpedo would imply about the Britannic status under international law. A torpedo is aimed. Someone looks through a periscope, identifies a target, and makes a decision to fire. If a German submarine commander made that decision on the morning of November 21st, 1916, while looking at a clearly marked hospital ship with a white hull, red crosses, and a green band running along its waterline, then either he was committing a deliberate war crime, or he had reason to believe the ship was not what it appeared to be. And the most obvious reason a submarine commander might have had for believing a hospital ship was not purely a hospital ship, is if he had intelligence, or simply suspicion, that it was carrying something other than medical personnel and patients. This is where the torpedo theory and the munitions question become entangled. The two ideas are not the same, and believing one does not require believing the other. It is possible that a torpedo was fired at the Britannic simply because a submarine commander made a decision that was wrong, illegal, and never officially admitted. It is also possible that a torpedo was fired because someone believed, rightly or wrongly, that the Britannic was a legitimate military target. And it is possible, of course, that no torpedo was fired at all, that the ship struck a mine, and that the speed of the sinking is explained by the combination of the mine strike and the open portholes, with no secondary cause required. What makes the munitions question so persistent and so difficult to dismiss is that it does not depend entirely on the torpedo theory to be relevant. Even if the Britannic struck a mine, the question of what the ship was carrying in its holds on the morning it sank is a separate question, and one that the official inquiry in 1916 did not examine with any depth. The inquiry was conducted under wartime conditions, with wartime priorities, and the British government had limited appetite for a detailed public examination of what a hospital ship requisitioned by the military might or might not have been carrying. The inquiry accepted the mine explanation, noted the open portholes as a contributing factor, and moved on. The war was still being fought. There were other ships, other losses, other things to attend to. The munitions question did not become a subject of serious research until decades later, when the wartime records began to be declassified and researchers started looking at the Britannic story with fresh eyes and fewer institutional pressures. What they found when they looked at those records was not a clear smoking gun in either direction. What they found was a set of documents that were incomplete in ways that were, to put it carefully, somewhat more incomplete than one might expect if there was nothing to hide. Some cargo manifests were missing. Some communications about the Britannic's voyages were restricted for longer than seemed necessary for a hospital ship on a routine mercy mission. Some researchers found these gaps suggestive. Others found them unremarkable, given the general state of wartime record-keeping and the decades that had passed since the sinking. Simon Mills, the British researcher who purchased the salvage rights to the Britannic wreck in 1996, and has spent more time studying the ship's history than perhaps anyone else alive, has examined the munitions question carefully and has been measured in his conclusions. He has noted that the evidence for munitions is circumstantial, that the physical evidence from the wreck does not confirm a secondary explosion consistent with munitions, and that the low casualty count is difficult to reconcile with the idea of a catastrophic secondary detonation of war materials. At the same time, he has acknowledged that the absence of confirmed evidence is not the same as confirmed absence, and that the British government's wartime records on the Britannic are not complete enough to allow a definitive conclusion. That tension between what the evidence shows and what it does not show is where the munitions question lives. It is not a settled matter, it is not a proven conspiracy, but it is also not a question that has been fully answered, and the people who have looked most closely at it tend to be the ones least willing to say it can be entirely set aside. The idea that a ship sailing under the protection of the Geneva Convention might have been carrying materials that would have voided the protection is not a comfortable idea, and it is not one that anyone with a stake in the official story has been eager to examine too closely. But discomfort is not the same as impossibility, and the Britannic story has, from the beginning, been a story about the gap between how things appear and how they actually are. The white hull and the red crosses said one thing. The speed of the sinking, the ambiguous German records, and the incomplete cargo documentation say something slightly different. Not necessarily a different conclusion, but a different level of certainty. And that difference, that gap between the official explanation and the full picture, is precisely why the Britannic story has continued to attract serious attention long after the wreck settled onto the floor of the Key Channel. The mine theory may be right. The open portholes may explain the speed. The German records may simply be incomplete by accident. The munitions question may have no answer because there are no munitions to find. But the wreck is still there, resting on its starboard side in the Aegean, with its most important section buried in sediment, and the questions it carries have not yet been answered. What the wreck has revealed about the sinking, and what it has deliberately withheld, is a story in itself, and it begins with the man who found it. The munitions question, then, is not really a single question. It is a cluster of smaller questions pressed together, and they do not all behave the same way under examination. The first question is simple enough in theory, though not in practice. Was the Britannic carrying war materials on the morning of November 21st, 1916? The second question, which only matters if the first is answered yes, is whether those materials contributed to the speed and violence of the sinking. And the third question, quieter and more uncomfortable than the others, is whether anyone in the British government knew, and whether the official story that emerged from the 1916 inquiry was shaped, even slightly, by a desire to protect the answer from becoming public. To understand why these questions have persisted, it helps to understand what the Geneva Convention actually required of a protected hospital ship in 1916. The rules were not vague. A hospital ship operating under the protection of the Convention was required to be clearly marked, to carry only medical personnel and patients, and to transport no war materials whatsoever. Not weapons, not munitions, not military supplies. The protection was absolute, but so was the obligation. A hospital ship that violated those conditions was not protected. It forfeited its status. And under international law as it existed at the time, a submarine commander who had credible reason to believe a hospital ship was carrying contraband was not necessarily acting illegally by targeting it. Whether that belief was correct or not was in practice almost impossible to verify from a periscope. The Britannic was not just any ship. It was a vessel requisitioned and operated by the British military, sailing routes that were strategically important in a war zone at a time when the British military was under enormous logistical pressure. The British Expeditionary Force and the campaigns in the Mediterranean and the Dardanelles had created supply chains of extraordinary complexity. Ships carried everything, and the lines between different categories of cargo were not always as clean in practice as they were on paper. This is not to say that the Britannic was definitely carrying munitions. It is to say that the context in which the question arises is not a paranoid one. It is a reasonable one, given what the war actually looked like from the inside. The specific claims about munitions have come from several directions over the years. Some researchers have pointed to the speed of the sinking as the most compelling piece of indirect evidence. A single mine strike, even a severe one, typically caused flooding that progressed over hours, not minutes. The Britannic sank in 55 minutes. The open portholes and gangway doors certainly accelerated the flooding, and most analysts agree that this was a significant factor. But some researchers have argued that the flooding, even accounting for the open portholes, was unusually rapid and widespread, and that a secondary explosion of some kind, possibly munitions detonating after the initial blast, could explain the difference. This argument is plausible in principle. Whether it is supported by the physical evidence from the wreck is a more complicated question. The wreck itself has been examined by several expeditions since Jacques Cousteau first located it in 1975, and the condition of the bow section, which is where the initial explosion occurred, has been one of the main focuses of those examinations. What the divers found was significant damage in the area of holds 2 and 3, consistent with a large explosion. The bow is partially buried in sediment, which limits how much can be seen from the outside. The damage pattern has been interpreted differently by different researchers. Some have said it is consistent with a mine strike and nothing more. Others have argued that the extent of the structural damage is somewhat greater than would be expected from a single mine, and that this leaves open the possibility of a secondary event. Neither interpretation can be confirmed without access to the interior of the wreck, and accessing the interior of a ship resting at 120 metres on its side, with a bow section buried in soft seabed sediment, is not a straightforward undertaking. Simon Mills has been careful on this point, and his caution is worth taking seriously, because he has had more access to the relevant documents and to the wreck than almost anyone else. He has stated clearly that the physical evidence from the wreck does not confirm a secondary explosion. He has also noted that the casualty figures are genuinely difficult to reconcile with the idea of a large secondary detonation. If munitions had detonated in the forward holds, the forward section of the ship would have experienced catastrophic structural failure almost instantly. The 30 people who died in the sinking were killed almost entirely in the lifeboat propeller incident, not in the explosion itself. The crew and nurses and medical staff who were in the forward sections of the ship had time to move, to respond, to evacuate. That timeline is more consistent with a mine strike and rapid flooding than with a massive secondary explosion of stored munitions. Mills has been measured in saying that this does not prove there were no munitions, only that the sinking does not look like what a catastrophic munitions detonation would look like. But then there are the documents, or rather the gaps where documents should be. The British National Archives contain records related to the Britannic's voyages, and researchers who have worked through those records have found that the cargo manifests for the Britannic's sixth voyage are not as complete as one might expect. Some documents that would normally exist for a voyage of that size and significance are absent. Some records that were classified during and after the war remained restricted for longer than seemed proportionate to their content, or at least longer than the content that eventually became visible would seem to justify. Mills and others have noted these gaps without drawing firm conclusions from them, which is the intellectually honest position to take. Incomplete records can mean many things. They can mean deliberate suppression. They can mean routine bureaucratic loss over a century of filing and refiling. They can mean that the records were never created in the first place, which itself can mean many things. The absence of a document is not evidence that the document existed and was removed, but it is also not evidence that the document existed and showed nothing of interest. What makes the cargo question particularly difficult to resolve is that hospital ships in the First World War operated in a grey area that the Geneva Convention had not fully anticipated. The Britannic was not just a ship with nurses on board. It was a military vessel, operated by the Royal Army Medical Corps, sailing in coordination with military operations. Its routes were determined by military need. Its supplies included not just medical equipment, but everything required to keep a large vessel operating in a war zone for extended periods. The line between medical supplies and military supplies was not always obvious. Morphine and surgical instruments were medical supplies. Coal was not, strictly speaking, a war material. But somewhere between those two categories was a range of goods that could be argued either way, and the question of where exactly the Britannic's cargo fell on that spectrum is not one that the 1916 inquiry addressed in any detail. The German position on hospital ships in the First World War is also relevant here, and it is a position that tends to get overlooked in English-language accounts of the Britannic. The German Navy was not simply indifferent to the Geneva Convention. German commanders and naval officials raised formal complaints multiple times during the war about Allied hospital ships that they believed were being used to transport troops and supplies under the protection of the Red Cross. Some of those complaints were documented, some were investigated by neutral parties and found to have merit. The Britannic was not specifically named in those complaints, at least not in any document that has become publicly available, but the broader pattern of German suspicion about Allied hospital ships is real, documented, and not entirely without foundation. Whether a German submarine commander in the Kiel Channel in November 1916 had specific intelligence about the Britannic, or was acting on general suspicion, or whether no torpedo was involved at all, is still not known. But the context in which German suspicion of Allied hospital ships existed is not invented. The question of whether the Britannic was carrying munitions has also been approached from a different angle by researchers, who have looked not at the wreck, but at the political and institutional incentives that shaped the official story. The British government in 1916 had strong reasons to want the Britannic story to be simple. A hospital ship sunk by a German mine was a propaganda asset. A hospital ship sunk because it was secretly carrying munitions was a legal and diplomatic liability. Even if the munitions were entirely innocent in terms of the sinking, even if they played no role in the explosion, their presence would have raised uncomfortable questions about whether the Britannic was entitled to the protection it was sailing under. Those questions would have been awkward for the British government, embarrassing in neutral countries, and potentially useful to German propagandists. The incentive to keep the cargo question quiet was real, regardless of what the cargo actually contained. This does not mean the cargo question was suppressed, but it means that the conditions under which suppression would have been likely to occur were present, and that is worth noting when evaluating the completeness of the official record. What the Cousteau expedition in 1975 found, and what subsequent expeditions have confirmed, is that the wreck of the Britannic is in a condition that makes definitive forensic analysis of the explosion site extremely difficult. The bow section, which is the part of the ship that matters most for answering the munitions question, is the most damaged and the most inaccessible part of the wreck. The sediment that has accumulated over more than a century of lying on the seabed has covered, and in some places partially filled the interior spaces most relevant to the investigation. Cousteau's team filmed what they could reach and noted what they could see, but they were working at the limits of the technology available in 1975, and the interior of the forward holds was not accessible to them in any meaningful way. Robert Ballard's 1995 expedition used more advanced equipment and was able to document the wreck in greater detail. But the fundamental problem remained the same. The part of the ship that holds the answer, if an answer exists, is the part of the ship that is hardest to examine. The wreck is now a protected war grave under Greek law. 30 people died on the Britannic, and their ship is their memorial. That protection is appropriate, and it is not something that researchers working seriously on the Britannic question argue against. But it does mean that any future investigation of the cargo question will have to be conducted with care, with official permission, and with technology capable of examining the interior of a heavily damaged bow section at 120 meters depth without disturbing the site. That technology is closer to existing now than it was in 1975 or 1995. Remotely operated vehicles with high-resolution imaging, sonar capable of mapping interior spaces without physical penetration, and analytical tools that can detect residue and material composition without direct sampling have all advanced considerably. Whether any future expedition will be permitted to use those tools in the Britannic's forward holds is a question for the Greek authorities, for the researchers with the institutional standing to make the case, and for the political will to examine a question that some people would still prefer to leave unanswered. What is certain is this: the munitions question has not been answered. It has not been answered by the wreck, which cannot be fully examined. It has not been answered by the documents, which are incomplete. It has not been answered by the 1916 inquiry, which did not ask it. And it has not been answered by the decades of research that have followed, which have produced careful, measured, inconclusive analysis from the people best positioned to know. Simon Mills, who has spent more time with this question than almost anyone, has consistently resisted the temptation to claim more than the evidence supports. That restraint is admirable, and it is also, in its own way, an answer of a kind. The fact that the person who has looked most closely at the munitions question is the one least willing to say it can be dismissed suggests that the question is genuinely open, not in the dramatic sense of a conspiracy waiting to be uncovered, but in the quieter sense of a historical record that has gaps where there should be clarity. The Britannic sank on a clear November morning in the Aegean, 55 minutes after an explosion whose cause has never been definitively established, carrying cargo whose nature has never been fully confirmed, in a war that created conditions in which the truth about such things was not always the first priority. The ship was doing what it was supposed to do, sailing toward a port where wounded men were waiting. Whether it was also doing something else, something that complicated its legal status and perhaps its fate, is a question that the sea has not yet answered. And so the story moves, as it must, from the question of what the Britannic was carrying to the question of what it looked like when someone finally went down to find it. Jacques Cousteau had already made the ocean famous by the time he turned his attention to the Britannic. His television series, his films, his books, his bright orange diving suits and the Calypso cutting through blue water, all of it had given millions of people their first real sense of what lay beneath the surface of the sea. He was, by 1975, one of the most recognisable scientists in the world, and his expeditions carried a certain weight that purely academic dives could not. When Cousteau went looking for something, people paid attention, and in the summer of 1975 he went looking for the Britannic. The wreck was not a complete mystery in terms of its location. the general area of the sinking had been known since 1916. Survivors had described the key channel, the island in the distance, the direction of the ship's final movement. What had not been done was a proper search with equipment capable of finding and filming a wreck at depth. The Aegean had simply not been searched with that kind of systematic attention. Cousteau's team used sonar equipment to sweep the channel floor, working from what the historical record suggested about where the ship had gone down. The Britannic was not difficult to find once you were looking in the right place and with the right tools. It is, after all, nearly 900 feet long. At 120 metres below the surface of the key channel, the wreck was sitting in water deep enough to be completely invisible from above, but not so deep as to be beyond the reach of the diving technology of the mid-1970s. Technical diving at that depth was demanding and required careful planning, but it was achievable. What Cousteau's team found when they reached the wreck was, by any measure, extraordinary. The Britannic was lying on its starboard side, tilted at roughly 90 degrees from upright, the starboard hull facing downward into the sediment, and the port side facing upward toward the surface. This is quite different from the condition of the Titanic, which broke apart before it reached the bottom, and rests in two large pieces surrounded by a wide field of debris. The Britannic is largely intact. It is enormous, and it is whole, at least in terms of its general structure, and that wholeness gives it a presence on the seabed that is genuinely difficult to describe. Cousteau himself spoke about it with something close to reverence. The ship is simply very large, and seeing something that large lying on the bottom of the sea, still recognisable as a ship still holding its shape after nearly 60 years underwater, is not an ordinary experience. The bow section is a different matter. The forward part of the ship, roughly the first 100 feet or so, is damaged and partially buried in the sediment that has built up over the decades. This is the section most affected by the original explosion, and it is also the section that has been most altered by the process of lying on the seabed for so long. The sediment in the key channel is soft in places, and the weight of the bow has pressed it down gradually over time, so that the very part of the ship most relevant to the question of what caused the sinking is the part least accessible and least readable. Cousteau's team could see the damage. They could see that the bow had been torn and deformed, but the specific character of the damage, the kind of information that might allow a forensic engineer to say with confidence whether this was caused by a mine or a torpedo, was not clearly legible from what could be filmed and observed from outside. The stern, by contrast, is in relatively good condition. The propellers are visible. The rudder is intact. The overall structure of the rear half of the ship is recognisable and well preserved. This is partly because the stern settled more gently, partly because it is not buried in the same way, and partly because the materials used in ship construction of that era were genuinely robust. Steel of that thickness, even after decades of immersion in salt water, does not simply disappear. It corrodes. It becomes encrusted with marine growth. It changes colour and texture, but it holds its shape. The Britannic's stern looks, in photographs taken by Cousteau's team and by subsequent expeditions, like what it is: the back half of a very large Edwardian ocean liner, lying on its side on the floor of the Aegean. One of the details that Cousteau's team documented, and that has since become one of the most discussed pieces of physical evidence in the Britannic story, is the open portholes. As the divers moved along the hull of the ship, they could see portholes that were open, or rather, portholes from which the glass had been removed or which had been left in the open position. This was not unusual for a hospital ship in the Mediterranean in November. The standard practice on hospital ships was to open portholes and gangway doors for ventilation, particularly in the warmer months, but also when the ship was in warmer waters or when the interior needed fresh air. The Britannic had been converted to carry hundreds of patients, and the air quality in a ship carrying that many people in enclosed spaces was a genuine medical concern. Opening portholes was not carelessness, it was standard procedure. But those open portholes had consequences when the ship began to flood. The Britannic's design placed many of its portholes relatively close to the waterline, and as the ship listed to starboard following the explosion, Those portholes on the starboard side descended toward and then below the surface of the water. Water poured in not just through the damaged area near the bow, but through multiple openings along the hull, and this accelerated the flooding in ways that the watertight compartment system had not been designed to compensate for. The system of watertight doors and bulkheads could slow flooding that entered through a breach in the hull. It could not stop flooding that entered through 100 open portholes as the ship rolled onto its side. Cousteau's observation of the open portholes was not a new theory. Survivors had described the porthole problem in 1916, and the British Inquiry had noted it. But seeing them physically, documented on film, gave the explanation a concreteness that written testimony alone could not provide. The Cousteau expedition also confirmed the general dimensions and position of the wreck, with enough precision to allow subsequent expeditions to plan their work more effectively. The Britannic lies with its bow pointing roughly northeast, at a depth that varies along the length of the ship because of the tilt. The deepest part of the wreck, the starboard side of the hull that is pressed into the sediment, is at around 120 metres. The highest part, the port side of the hull facing upward, is somewhat shallower. This gradient matters for diving operations because the physiological limits on how long a diver can safely work at depth change with every few metres, and planning a dive on a wreck that spans a significant depth range requires careful calculation. At 120 metres, the Britannic is what divers classify as a technical dive. Recreational scuba diving, the kind most people are familiar with, typically has a practical limit of around 40 metres. Beyond that, the physics of breathing compressed gas at depth create increasing risks of nitrogen narcosis, oxygen toxicity and decompression sickness. Technical diving uses specialised gas mixtures, including helium-based mixes that reduce narcosis at depth, and involves staged decompression stops during the ascent to allow dissolved gases to leave the body safely. A dive to the Britannic is not something a recreational diver can simply do. It requires training, equipment, experience, and planning that takes the better part of a day for what might be a relatively short period of bottom time. This is one reason the wreck has not been visited as often as its historical significance might suggest. It is accessible, but it is not easy. Robert Ballard reached the Britannic in 1995, 20 years after Cousteau. Ballard is best known for finding the Titanic in 1985, and his return to the Olympic-class ships with the Britannic was a natural extension of that work. By 1995, remotely operated vehicle technology had advanced significantly from what had been available in 1975, and Ballard's expedition was able to document the wreck in considerably greater detail. His team used ROVs to explore sections of the wreck that divers could not safely reach, including some interior spaces and areas of the hull that had been inaccessible to Cousteau's team. The footage and data from the 1995 expedition produced a much more detailed picture of the wreck's condition and confirmed many of the observations Cousteau had made while adding new detail. Ballard's expedition also examined the damage to the bow section more closely than had previously been possible. The conclusion, broadly speaking, was consistent with what the mine theory would predict. A localised explosion on the starboard side that had torn open the hull in the forward area, followed by rapid flooding accelerated by the open portholes and the ship's movement through the water. But the damage was also consistent, in its general character, with what a torpedo strike might produce. The distinction between mine damage and torpedo damage at the scale visible on the exterior of a heavily corroded wreck, after nearly 80 years on the seabed, is not something that can be made with certainty by looking at photographs and ROV footage. The forensic specificity that would be needed to settle the question is simply not available from the outside of the hull. There is something quietly strange about visiting the Britannic on film or in photographs, even from the distance of a screen. The ship is covered in decades of marine growth, anemones, corals, sponges, and the soft incrustation that accumulates on any hard surface left in the sea long enough. The colours are muted, as they always are at depth where light is absorbed before it reaches the bottom. The red crosses that were painted on the hull in 1915 are not visible in any clear way in most of the footage, though some accounts from early divers suggested that faint traces of the markings could still be made out on certain sections of the hull. Whether that is accurate or a matter of hopeful interpretation is hard to say. What is clear is that the ship no longer looks like a ship, in the way a ship in a harbour looks like a ship. It looks like something that has been reclaimed. The sea has been working on it for more than 100 years, and the sea is patient. The wreck has been visited by a number of expeditions since Ballard's, including dives organised by Titanic researcher and historian Simon Mills, who purchased the salvage rights to the wreck in 1996, and has been the most consistent advocate for both its protection and its serious study. Mills has been careful about what he claims and what he does not claim, which is worth noting in a field where dramatic assertions sometimes travel faster than careful analysis. His expeditions have added to the photographic and structural record of the wreck, without making claims that the evidence cannot support. The Greek government's designation of the wreck as a protected war grave has added a layer of legal protection that limits what can be done at the site, and that protection is broadly respected by the research community. What all of these expeditions together have established is a fairly detailed picture of what the Britannic looks like now, and a less complete picture of what happened to it on the morning of November 21st, 1916. The wreck confirms the open portholes, it confirms the starboard side damage to the forward hull, it confirms the general sequence of flooding that survivors described. It confirms that the ship is largely intact, and that the stern in particular is in remarkable condition for a vessel that has been on the seabed since the First World War. What it does not confirm, and what no amount of external examination has yet been able to confirm, is the precise cause of the explosion that started everything. The answer to that question, if it exists in a recoverable form, is somewhere inside the damaged and sediment-covered forward section of the hull, in the part of the ship that is hardest to reach and most carefully protected. There is a particular quality to the Britannic's presence on the seabed that distinguishes it from the Titanic in ways beyond the merely physical. The Titanic is a wreck that has been intensively studied, extensively filmed, and widely discussed for decades. Its story is one of the most thoroughly examined maritime disasters in history. The Britannic has received a fraction of that attention, and yet it is in some ways the more mysterious ship. It sank faster, in a war under disputed circumstances, carrying cargo that has never been fully accounted for, and its wreck has never been examined with the thoroughness that the Titanic has received. It sits in 120 metres of Aegean water, largely intact, holding whatever it holds, and the most important questions about it remain open. That combination, a well-preserved wreck, a disputed cause, an incomplete record, and a protected legal status that limits investigation, is what makes the Britannic such an unusual case. The wreck is there. The evidence, or at least some of it, may still be there. But getting to it in a way that could actually answer the remaining questions requires not just technology, but permission, institutional support, and a willingness to ask questions that some people would still find uncomfortable. And so the ship continues to lie on its side in the key channel, patient in the way that only wrecks can be, while the questions that surround it remain unresolved above the surface. What the Cousteau expedition did, beyond documenting the wreck itself, was bring the Britannic back into public awareness in a meaningful way. Before 1975, the ship was known primarily to maritime historians and to people with a particular interest in the White Star Line or the First World War. After Cousteau's footage circulated, the Britannic became something that a broader audience could picture and think about. It was no longer just a name in a list of wartime losses. It was a visible thing, a massive tilted shape on the floor of the Aegean, recognisable as a ship, enormous and strange and real. That visibility changed the nature of the conversation around the Britannic, and it opened the door to the subsequent decades of more focused investigation that have brought the story to where it stands today. And yet, for all that the wreck has revealed, the most important witness to what happened on the morning of November 21st, 1916, was not a piece of steel or a flooded porthole. It was a person. A woman who had been on 3 of these ships and had survived all 3 of them, who had watched the Britannic sink from the water and who had written down what she remembered of it years later in a memoir that was not published until after she was gone. Her name was Violet Jessop, and her story runs through the history of the Olympic-class ships like a thread that connects all 3 disasters in a way that no other single life quite does. Violet Jessop was born in 1887 in Bahia Blanca, Argentina, to Irish immigrant parents. Her father died when she was young, and her mother worked as a stewardess on passenger ships to support the family. Jessop grew up in that particular world of ocean travel, the below-decks world, the service world, the world of people who kept large ships running smoothly while the passengers above them worried about other things. She was not a wealthy traveller. She was not a famous person. She was a young woman who needed work and who was good at the work she found. She joined the White Star Line as a stewardess in 1908, and by the time she was in her early 20s, she was one of the more experienced members of the onboard service staff on some of the largest ships in the world. She was aboard the Olympic in September 1911 when it collided with the British warship HMS Hawke in the Solent, the stretch of water between the southern coast of England and the Isle of Wight. The collision was serious. The Hawke's bow struck the Olympic on the starboard side near the stern, tearing open 2 compartments and causing significant structural damage. No one was killed, but the Olympic had to return to Belfast for repairs, and the incident became part of the broader legal and financial saga surrounding the White Star Line's relationship with its insurers. For Jessop, it was a frightening experience on a ship she was working on, and she survived it without serious injury. She probably thought that was the end of it. Then, less than a year later, in April 1912, she was aboard the Titanic. She had been asked to sail on the Titanic's maiden voyage, partly because her experience and her calm manner made her a valued member of the crew. The Titanic sank on the night of April 14, 1912, after striking an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Jessop survived. She was assigned to Lifeboat 16, one of the boats launched from the port side. In her memoir, which she wrote in the 1950s but which was not published until 1997, more than 2 decades after her death, she described the night with a kind of quiet precision that feels more honest than dramatic. She wrote about the cold, about the confusion, about watching the ship go down from the water. She also mentioned, in a detail that has been repeated often since, that someone placed a baby in her arms as she sat in the lifeboat, and that the next morning the baby was gone, taken by someone she assumed its mother without a word. Whether that detail is literally accurate or has been softened or shaped by memory and time is impossible to know now, but it is the kind of specific, strange, human detail that stays with you. She returned to sea after the Titanic. This is worth pausing on for a moment, because most people, having survived a shipwreck of that magnitude, might reasonably have found a different profession. Jessop went back to work on ships. She continued her career with the White Star Line and later with other companies, and by 1916 she was serving as a nurse aboard the Britannic, which by that point had been requisitioned as a hospital ship and was making its regular runs between Southampton and the eastern Mediterranean. She was 38 years old when the Britannic sank. She had already survived a serious collision and the worst peacetime maritime disaster in history. And now she was aboard a ship that struck something in the Key Channel at 8:12 in the morning and began to go down in under an hour. Her account of the Britannic sinking is one of the few detailed first-hand descriptions that survive from someone who was both present and observant enough to record what she saw. She described the explosion as a sudden violent shudder, a sound and a feeling that she recognised immediately as something catastrophic. She described the way the ship began to tilt almost at once, the angle increasing steadily as the minutes passed. She described the organised chaos of the evacuation, the nurses and medical staff moving to their stations, the officers trying to maintain order, the sense that people were doing what they had been trained to do even as the situation deteriorated around them. She eventually jumped from the ship into the sea. The Britannic was still moving at this point. its engines still turning as Captain Bartlett attempted to drive the ship toward the island of Keir and beach it before it went under. Jumping from a moving ship into open water is not a safe thing to do, but the alternative was remaining on a vessel that was visibly sinking and tilting. She jumped. She described being pulled down beneath the surface, sucked under by the force of the water around the ship, and she described the particular terror of being underwater and unable to surface, the water pulling at her, the light above her unreachable for a moment that must have felt much longer than it was. She did surface. She was picked up. She survived. In her memoir, she wrote about the Britannic with a kind of measured sadness rather than bitterness or drama. She'd been through enough by that point that her descriptions carry a particular weight. She was not writing to be sensational. She was writing to remember, and the remembering comes through in the specificity of what she chose to include and what she chose to leave out. She is sometimes called Miss Unsinkable, which is a nickname that she herself apparently found a little tiresome. It is a neat label, and neat labels tend to flatten complicated people. The real story is not that she was lucky across 3 disasters, though she was. The real story is that she kept going back. She worked at sea for most of her adult life. She survived the Olympic collision, the Titanic sinking, and the Britannic sinking, and she continued her career in ocean travel afterward. She did not retire from the sea after the Britannic. She went on to work for other shipping companies and eventually retired in the 1950s to a cottage in Suffolk, England, where she kept a small farm and lived quietly until her death in 1971 at the age of 83. She outlived the ships. She outlived most of the people who'd been on them with her. She lived long enough to see the Titanic become the defining cultural memory of the Olympic class, and she lived long enough to begin writing down her own version of events, a version that was more complicated and more human than the one that had become popular. Her memoir was edited by John Maxton Graham and published posthumously under the title Titanic Survivor, which is accurate but also a little reductive, given that she survived 3 incidents on 3 different ships and had a great deal more to say about all of them. What her account adds to the Britannic story specifically is a ground-level perspective on what the evacuation felt like from inside it. The official inquiry, such as it was, focused on the cause of the sinking and on the broad sequence of events. Jessop's memoir fills in the texture of those 55 minutes in a way that official documents cannot. She describes the tilt of the deck, the sound of the water, the behaviour of the people around her, the decisions that were made and the ones that were not made. She describes the lifeboat incident, the boats that were lowered while the propellers were still turning, with a kind of horrified clarity. She was close enough to see what happened. She wrote about it in terms that make clear she never forgot it. Her presence across all 3 Olympic-class ships is one of those coincidences that history occasionally produces and that no reasonable person would invent in a novel because it would seem too contrived. The 3 ships were built together, launched within a few years of each other, operated by the same company, and crewed in part by the same people. It is not entirely surprising that a long-serving stewardess with the White Star Line would have been aboard more than one of them. But all 3, across a collision, a sinking and a wartime disaster, is still a remarkable thing. She was not the only crew member to serve on multiple Olympic-class ships, but she is the only one known to have been present on all 3 and to have survived all 3 incidents. There is a temptation to read her story as purely a story about luck, and luck was certainly part of it. But the other part is something more ordinary and more interesting. She was competent. She was calm under pressure. She knew what to do in an emergency because she had been trained, and because, by the time the Britannic sank, she had already been through 2 previous disasters and had some sense of how to move through that kind of chaos without freezing. Whether that experience actually helped her on the Britannic, or whether she survived simply because she was in the right place at the right moment, is impossible to know. Both things were probably true to some degree. What is certain is that her account of the Britannic is one of the most valuable pieces of first-hand testimony that exists about the sinking, and it has been used by historians and researchers as a primary source for understanding what those 55 minutes were actually like for the people inside them. Her description of the explosion, of the tilt, of the open portholes and the rushing water, of the chaos around the lifeboats, and of the moment she jumped into the sea, all of it fits with and in some cases adds detail to the physical and documentary record in ways that have proven useful to people trying to understand exactly what happened. She also raises, without quite answering, some of the questions that have surrounded the sinking for over a century. Her description of the explosion is consistent with a mine strike, but it is also consistent with other causes. She did not claim to know what caused the explosion. She knew what she felt and what she saw, and she wrote that down. The interpretation was left to others. Her memoir is a strange and valuable document. It was written by a woman in her 60s and 70s, looking back at events that had happened decades earlier, and it carries the inevitable qualities of late-life memory. Some things vivid and precise, others softened or uncertain. She was not a trained historian or a naval expert. She was a person who had been present at extraordinary events and who wanted to record them before she was gone. The result is imperfect and human, and more useful for that. There is something quietly remarkable about the fact that her memoir was not published until 1997, 26 years after her death. She had written it, had clearly wanted it to exist, and yet it sat unpublished for decades. When it finally appeared, it added a dimension to the Britannic story and to the broader Titanic narrative that had been missing. The perspective of someone who had actually been there, who had done the work of keeping those ships running, and who had survived when many others had not. She's buried in a churchyard in Great Ashfield in Suffolk, not far from the cottage where she spent her final years. Her gravestone is modest. She's remembered now primarily through the nickname she disliked, and through the memoir she wrote in private and never saw in print. The ships she sailed on are all gone, 2 of them in pieces on the ocean floor, 1 of them broken up for scrap in 1935. She outlasted all of them, which is perhaps the most remarkable thing about her story. More remarkable even than the coincidence of the 3 disasters, that she simply kept going, kept working, kept living, long after the ships that made her story famous had ceased to exist. Her account of the Britannic ends in the water, being pulled under and then surfacing, being lifted into a rescue boat, looking back at the ship as it went down. That image, a person in the water watching a massive vessel disappear, is one of the recurring images of the Olympic-class story. She had seen something like it before, from a lifeboat in the North Atlantic in 1912. This time she was closer, in the water rather than in a boat, and the ship was smaller and faster in its going. The Aegean in November is not as cold as the North Atlantic in April, but it is cold enough, and the chaos around her was real enough, and the people who did not survive were real people. Her survival, and the survival of most of the people aboard, is one of the genuinely striking facts of the Britannic sinking. 30 people died out of more than 1,000 aboard. That number is worth holding for a moment, because given the speed of the sinking, given the conditions, given the chaos that Jessup and others described, it could easily have been much worse. The reasons it was not worse are partly the result of good decisions, and partly the result of bad luck being distributed unevenly, and partly the result of the particular circumstances of the sinking itself. But those 30 deaths were not evenly distributed across the 55 minutes of the sinking. The majority of them happened in a specific, terrible and largely preventable way, concentrated in a few minutes of chaos near the stern of the ship, in an incident that Jessup witnessed and that has haunted the Britannic story ever since. That incident was the lifeboat propeller disaster, and it is one of the most documented and in some ways most painful episodes of the entire sinking. It accounts for the majority of the 30 deaths. It was not caused by the explosion, it was not caused by flooding or by the speed of the ship's descent. It was caused by decisions made in the chaos of those first minutes, by communication that broke down, by a ship still moving through the water while people were being lowered into it. To understand what happened, it helps to picture the situation as it was unfolding in the minutes after the explosion. The Britannic had been struck at around 8:12 in the morning. The ship was moving at approximately 21 knots, which is fast for a vessel of that size, roughly 24 miles per hour, and it was heading toward the island of Kea. Captain Charles Bartlett had made a decision almost immediately after the explosion to keep the engines running and try to beach the ship on the island, which was about 3 miles away. His reasoning was straightforward. If he could get the ship into shallow water before it sank, the death toll would be far lower. The seafloor near Kea was close enough to the surface that even a sunken ship might leave its upper decks accessible. It was not an irrational decision. In fact, it was arguably the right instinct given what he knew in those first minutes. But the ship was listing and flooding faster than anyone had anticipated. The bow was going down. The stern was rising. And as the bow dipped lower into the water, the propellers at the stern began to lift, rising toward and then partially above the surface. The great bronze screws, each one enormous, each one still turning, came up out of the depths and into the air and into the space where the water met the sky, right at the place where lifeboats would be lowered from the stern. On the starboard side, where the list was pulling the ship down, some of the crew and medical staff had begun lowering lifeboats before the order was given. This is the core of the incident. Bartlett had not yet ordered the lifeboats away. He was still trying to beach the ship. He had not stopped the engines, and while he was focused on the navigation problem, while the bridge was dealing with the immediate crisis of a listing, flooding vessel moving at speed, some of the people on the boat deck made the decision to start lowering on their own. The new davit system the Britannic carried was one of its post-Titanic improvements. It was a gantry-style design, sometimes called the well-in-quadrant davit system, capable of swinging out and lowering multiple lifeboats from a single station. It had been designed specifically to address one of the Titanic's failures, which was the inability to launch enough boats quickly enough. The Britannic could theoretically launch all 48 of its lifeboats from either side of the ship, which was a genuine improvement over what had come before. But the system required people who knew exactly how to operate it, under controlled conditions, with the ship relatively stable and the engines stopped, or at least slow. None of those conditions existed on the morning of November the 21st, 1916. The boats that were lowered prematurely on the starboard side went into the water, while the ship was still moving at speed. The water rushing past the hull pulled the boats aft, toward the stern, toward the propellers. Some accounts suggest the boats were not fully released from their falls before the current took them. Others suggest the people in the boats tried to row away, but could not fight the pressure of the water moving past the hull at that speed. The result, regardless of the exact sequence, was that the boats were drawn into the churning wake of the still-turning propellers. The propellers of a ship the size of the Britannic were not small things. Each one was around 23 feet in diameter. They were made of manganese bronze and weighed many tons. When they were turning, they created a powerful suction and turbulence in the water behind them. A wooden lifeboat, even a large one, had no chance against that force. The boats were pulled in and destroyed. The people in them were killed. Some were struck directly. Some were thrown into the water by the impact and drowned. Some were pulled under by the propeller wash and did not come back up. Violet Jessup was near this area when it happened. Her account describes the sound and the sight of it, and it is not something she recorded lightly or in dramatic terms. She described it in the plain language of someone who saw something terrible and was trying to put it into words years later without making it more or less than what it was. The boats were there, and then they were not. The people in them were there, and then they were not. The propellers kept turning for some time after. Around 28 to 30 people died in this incident. The exact number is difficult to confirm because the records from the sinking are not complete, and some of the victims were never recovered. But it is generally accepted that the propeller deaths account for the large majority of the total death toll, which means that of the 30 people who died on the Britannic that morning, most of them died not from the explosion, not from drowning in the flooding compartments, not from the ship going down, but from this specific sequence of events near the stern in the minutes before Bartlett finally stopped the engines and gave the order to abandon ship. Bartlett did eventually stop the engines, He gave the order when it became clear that the ship could not make it to the island, that the flooding was too fast, that beaching was not going to happen. By that point, the ship had about 20 minutes left. The remaining lifeboats were launched successfully, and the survival rate for everyone else aboard was extraordinarily high. But the propeller deaths had already happened. The question of who bears responsibility for those deaths is uncomfortable and has never been fully resolved. The crew members who lowered the boats without orders were acting, presumably, out of a desire to save lives. They saw a sinking ship. They had lifeboats. They lowered them. The logic was not wrong in the abstract, but the execution in those specific conditions, with the ship still moving at speed, was catastrophic. Whether they knew the engines were still running, whether they understood the propeller risk, whether anyone tried to stop them, these are questions the historical record does not answer cleanly. Bartlett himself survived the sinking and was later cleared of any wrongdoing by the official inquiry. His decision to keep the engines running and try to beach the ship was examined and accepted as a reasonable command decision under the circumstances. The inquiry did not assign blame for the propeller deaths in any specific way. The war was still ongoing, the inquiry was brief, there were other things to attend to. What the incident reveals about the Britannic's new lifeboat system is worth thinking about. The gantry davits were a genuine improvement over the Titanic's equipment. They could handle more boats, swing them out more efficiently, and in theory provide a faster evacuation. But a davit system is only as good as the people operating it, and the people operating it are only as effective as the communication and command structure around them. The Titanic had too few boats and too slow a launch rate. The Britannic had enough boats, but launched some of them at the wrong moment. Different problems, different mechanisms, similarly tragic outcomes in the places where things went wrong. There is also the question of what the davit system was designed to handle. It was designed for a controlled emergency, one where the captain had time to give orders, where the ship was stopped or nearly stopped, where the crew could follow procedure in sequence. What it was not designed for, what no lifeboat system of that era was truly designed for, was a sinking that happened faster than anyone expected, with a ship listing and moving and flooding all at once, with communication breaking down between the bridge and the boat deck, with people making individual decisions in the absence of clear orders. This is not a criticism of the designers or the crew. It is simply a recognition that the gap between a system designed for an emergency and the actual conditions of that emergency can be very wide. The Titanic inquiry had pointed to that gap in 1912. The Britannic's propeller incident pointed to a different version of the same gap 4 years later. The lesson, if there was one, was that equipment matters less than the conditions under which it is used, and the conditions of a fast sinking in wartime in the early morning are about as far from ideal as conditions get. Captain Bartlett's decision to keep the engines running has been debated by researchers and historians for decades. The argument in his favour is clear. Beaching the ship was the fastest way to save the most lives, and had it worked, the death toll might have been close to zero. The argument against is equally clear. The moving ship created the propeller risk that killed 30 people, and stopping the engines immediately would have eliminated that risk, even if it meant the ship sank in deeper water. Both arguments are reasonable. Both are made with the benefit of hindsight, which Bartlett did not have. He had a few minutes, a flooding ship, and an island 3 miles away. He made a call. What is harder to assess is whether anyone on the boat deck knew or should have known that the propellers were rising and turning. The stern of a ship as large as the Britannic would not have made the propeller danger immediately obvious to someone standing at a davit station amidships or forward. The noise of the flooding, the list, the general chaos of a ship in distress, all of it would have made it difficult to assess the full picture. It is possible that the people who lowered those boats had no idea what they were lowering them into. It is also possible that someone knew and lowered them anyway, believing the risk was worth taking. Without testimony from those specific crew members, it is impossible to say. What Jessop's account and the accounts of other survivors make clear is that the chaos of the evacuation was real and significant, that the 55 minutes of the sinking were not calm or orderly, that decisions were being made at multiple levels simultaneously without full information, and that the outcome, 30 dead out of more than 1,000, was in some ways a near miracle given the conditions, and in other ways a tragedy that did not have to happen the way it did. The propeller incident is sometimes treated as a footnote to the Britannic story, overshadowed by the larger questions of what caused the explosion and why the ship sank so fast. But it is not a footnote. It is the centre of the human cost of the sinking. It is where most of the deaths occurred. It is where the gap between good equipment and good outcomes was most visible. And it is the part of the story that most clearly shows what 55 minutes of chaos actually looks like from the inside. Not dramatic in the way that disaster stories are often made dramatic, but specific and terrible, and rooted in the ordinary failures of communication and timing that tend to determine how badly things go wrong when they go wrong. The 30 people who died on the Britannic that morning have names, though they are not often listed in the broad retellings of the story. They were crew members, orderlies, nurses, medical staff. They had come aboard a hospital ship to do a specific kind of work, to care for wounded soldiers, to sail between Southampton and the Mediterranean and back again, to be part of a mercy operation in the middle of a war. Most of them survived. 30 did not, and the way most of them died, pulled into the propellers of a ship that was still trying to reach an island 3 miles away, is one of the harder details of the story to sit with. The survivors were in the water and in lifeboats for roughly an hour before rescue arrived. The Aegean in November is cold, but not lethally so for short periods, and the rescue was relatively fast. Nearby vessels responded. Greek fishing boats came out from the island. HMS Scourge arrived. The operation was not perfect, but it was fast enough that the people in the water survived it. The majority of those aboard the Britannic were home within days. What they came home to was a country still at war, a government with limited interest in examining the details of what had happened, and a public that was focused on the larger catastrophe unfolding across the Western Front. The Britannic sinking was reported, noted, and then largely set aside. The inquiry that followed was brief and did not probe deeply into the questions that have occupied researchers ever since, and the ship itself settled into the Aegean, onto its starboard side at 120 metres depth, in the key channel where it had been struck, and began the long, slow process of becoming what it is now, a wreck rather than a ship, a grave rather than a vessel, a question rather than an answer. The propeller deaths and the decisions that led to them were never fully reckoned with in any official way. They were part of a war, and in a war, 30 deaths on a hospital ship, however terrible, did not demand the kind of sustained public inquiry that 30 deaths in peacetime might have produced. That is simply the arithmetic of wartime, which is its own kind of uncomfortable truth. The story moved on before it had been fully examined, and that pattern of the Britannic story being noted and then set aside, of important questions being raised and then left open, turns out to be one of the defining features of the entire aftermath of the sinking. The survivors who came ashore in the days after November 21st, 1916, came back to a world that was, in a very practical sense, too busy to stop and think about what had just happened. Britain in late 1916 was not short of disasters. The Somme offensive had ended less than 2 weeks later, in mid-November, having cost over 1 million casualties on all sides across 4.5 months of fighting. The war was consuming everything: attention, resources, grief, institutional energy. A hospital ship sunk in the Aegean with 30 dead was a tragedy, but it was a small tragedy by the standards of that year, and the machinery of official response treated it accordingly. The survivors were rescued by a combination of vessels that happened to be in the area. HMS Scourge, a British destroyer, arrived and took on survivors. Several Greek fishing boats came out from the island of Kea, which sits just a few miles from where the Britannic went down. The fishermen of Kea had seen the enormous white ship passing through their channel on previous voyages. On the morning of November the 21st, they saw it listing and sinking, and they launched their boats. That detail tends to get lost in the broader telling, but it matters. Some of the people who survived the Britannic did so because Greek fishermen in small wooden boats rowed out into the Aegean on a November morning and pulled them from the water. The rescue was relatively fast. Most survivors were ashore or aboard rescue vessels within an hour or two of the sinking. The cold was manageable, the sea conditions were not extreme, and the number of people in the water, while large, was not so overwhelming that the rescue effort collapsed under its own weight. Violet Jessop, who had survived being briefly sucked under by the propeller wash before surfacing, was among those pulled from the water. She later described the experience with characteristic understatement, noting that she had bumped her head on what she believed was the ship's keel as she was pulled down, and that she had come up gasping and disoriented before being collected by a lifeboat. She was treated, recovered, and was back at work within a relatively short period. That is perhaps the most remarkable sentence in her entire remarkable story. She survived the Olympic collision, the Titanic sinking, and the Britannic disaster, and between each of them, she went back to sea. Whatever one makes of that, it is hard not to feel a kind of quiet admiration for the sheer stubbornness of it. The British inquiry into the sinking was opened and concluded with a speed that stands in sharp contrast to the Titanic inquiries of 1912. After the Titanic, both Britain and the United States conducted extensive formal investigations. The British Board of Trade inquiry ran for 36 days and heard testimony from 96 witnesses. The American Senate inquiry began 4 days after the Titanic reached New York and examined 82 witnesses over 18 days. Both inquiries produced lengthy reports, debated causes, assigned responsibility, and led to changes in maritime law. The Britannic inquiry was nothing like that. It was brief, largely administrative, and produced a conclusion that accepted the mine explanation without deeply examining the alternative theories or the specific circumstances of the sinking. The war was still happening. The Admiralty had limited appetite for a prolonged public examination of a hospital ship disaster that raised uncomfortable questions about whether hospital ships were being used appropriately. The inquiry found what it needed to find, recorded it, and moved on. That is not quite the same as a cover-up, and it is worth being careful about the distinction. There is no strong evidence that the British government deliberately suppressed inconvenient truths about the Britannic in a coordinated or conspiratorial way. What happened is more mundane and in some ways more troubling than conspiracy. Institutional indifference, wartime prioritization, and the simple fact that no one with sufficient authority was motivated to push harder. The questions that researchers have spent decades asking were available to be asked in 1916 and 1917. They were not asked, not because asking them was forbidden, but because nobody in a position to demand answers thought it was worth the trouble. That kind of forgetting is harder to argue against than a deliberate suppression. You cannot point to a document that says, "Do not investigate this." You can only point to the absence of investigation and wonder at it. The Britannic story then did something that stories do when they are not examined. It faded. The Titanic had become a cultural event by 1912, a moral story about hubris and class and the limits of human confidence. A disaster that arrived at exactly the right cultural moment to become something larger than itself. The Britannic had no such moment. It sank in wartime, in a theatre of war most British civilians could not locate on a map, on a ship that had never carried paying passengers and therefore had no famous names in its manifest, no first-class dining rooms full of society figures, no iceberg, no midnight drama. It was a hospital ship that hit something in the Aegean and sank in 55 minutes. The story had no obvious moral shape. It did not fit the narrative templates that make disasters memorable, and so, largely, it was forgotten. For most of the 20th century, the Britannic occupied a strange position in maritime history. Technically significant, practically unknown. People who knew about the Titanic often had no idea that the Titanic had a sister ship, let alone that the sister ship had also sunk. The Olympic, the eldest of the three, at least had a long career as a working passenger liner to give it some presence in the historical record. The Britannic had 6 voyages as a hospital ship, and then 120 metres of water above it. It was the least famous of the three by such a wide margin that its name barely registered in popular consciousness. Jacques Cousteau's 1975 expedition changed that, at least among people who followed maritime history closely. Finding the wreck and filming it gave the Britannic a physical presence it had lacked for nearly 60 years. Here was the ship, on its side in the Aegean, enormous and largely intact. The red crosses still faintly visible on the hull in some accounts. The open portholes exactly where survivors had said they would be. The Cousteau expedition did not answer the central questions about the sinking, but it confirmed the scale of what was down there and gave researchers something concrete to work with. The wreck became a destination, a subject, a site rather than just a name in a footnote. Robert Ballard, who had found the Titanic in 1985, led an expedition to the Britannic in 1995. His team used remotely operated vehicles to survey the wreck in considerable detail, mapping the damage to the bow section, examining the hull plating, documenting the state of preservation. The Ballard expedition produced some of the most detailed imagery of the wreck that existed at that point, and confirmed several things that had been debated: the extent of the damage near the bow, the position of the open gangway doors, the overall condition of the ship. What it could not do, because the bow section is heavily damaged and partially buried in sediment, was provide definitive forensic evidence about the nature of the initial explosion. The damage is consistent with a mine strike. It is also, some researchers argue, consistent with a torpedo strike. The wreck itself, frustratingly, does not resolve the question. Simon Mills is perhaps the person who has done the most to keep the Britannic story alive in the modern era. Mills, a British researcher and author, purchased the salvage rights to the wreck in 1996, which gave him a formal legal relationship with the site and a platform from which to advocate for its proper study and protection. He has written about the Britannic extensively, investigated the munitions question seriously and carefully, and pushed for the wreck to be treated with the same respect afforded to other war graves. His position on the munitions question is measured. He acknowledges that the evidence is incomplete, that some wartime records are missing or were never kept, and that the question cannot be definitively answered from the outside of the wreck. But he does not dismiss the possibility, and he has argued that the question deserves honest examination rather than reflexive denial. The Greek government designated the Britannic wreck as a protected war grave, which places legal restrictions on what can be done at the site. Diving on the wreck is possible, as it sits within the range of technical divers with the appropriate equipment and certification, but excavation, salvage, and the removal of artifacts are prohibited. This protection is appropriate given that 30 people died on the ship and their remains may still be present in the wreck. It also means, practically speaking, that the most definitive way of answering the munitions question, a systematic interior examination of the cargo holds, cannot be conducted under current legal frameworks. Future technology, specifically improved remotely operated vehicles capable of navigating interior spaces at depth, may eventually allow a more thorough non-invasive survey. But that technology does not yet exist in a form that could answer the specific questions the Britannic poses, and even if it did, the legal and ethical framework for using it would need to be carefully constructed. The centenary of the sinking in 2016 brought a modest renewal of public interest. Documentaries were made, articles were written, the basic facts of the story reached a wider audience than they had in decades. The centenary coverage tended to focus on the Violet Jessup angle, on the comparison with Titanic, and on the mine versus torpedo debate, which is the most accessible version of the mystery for a general audience. The munitions question received less attention, partly because it is more complex and partly because it remains genuinely unresolved. And unresolved questions are harder to present in the clean narrative arc that anniversary coverage tends to prefer. What the centenary coverage also did, to its credit, was begin to name more of the 30 people who died. Maritime disasters tend to be remembered through their survivors, through the famous names, the dramatic escapes, the remarkable stories. The people who do not survive are often reduced to a number, and the Britannic's 30 are no exception to that tendency. They were, in the main, crew members and medical staff, people who had signed on for a hospital ship voyage in the middle of a war, people doing specific and difficult work, people with families and addresses and histories that did not make it into the standard retellings. The effort to recover their individual identities, to put names to the number, is slow and ongoing, and it is the kind of work that tends to happen at the edges of official history rather than at its centre. The Britannic Inquiry's brevity and the subsequent institutional forgetting of the story had one lasting practical consequence that is worth noting. The questions it left open have never been officially addressed. There has been no formal revisitation of the 1916 inquiry, no government review of the wartime records, no official statement on the munitions question. The British government's position, to the extent that it has one, remains essentially the position of the 1916 inquiry. The ship struck a mine. It sank. The matter is closed. That position may well be correct. The mine theory is well supported and widely accepted among maritime historians, but the fact that it has never been subjected to the kind of rigorous official scrutiny that the Titanic sinking received means that the alternative theories have never been formally considered and formally rejected. They exist in a kind of permanent suspension, neither confirmed nor definitively ruled out, which is precisely the condition that keeps them alive in the literature and in the minds of researchers. There is something worth sitting with in the contrast between how the Titanic and the Britannic have been treated by history. The Titanic sank in peacetime on its maiden voyage, with a passenger list that included some of the wealthiest people in the world. The disaster was exhaustively investigated, extensively reported, endlessly retold, and has become one of the most studied maritime events in history. The Britannic sank in wartime, on a mercy mission, with a crew of medical personnel and a cargo of hospital equipment. It was briefly investigated, quickly forgotten, and spent most of the 20th century as a footnote. The 30 people who died on the Britannic are, in aggregate, less well remembered than individual passengers who died on the Titanic. That disparity is not the result of any single decision or any deliberate act of erasure. It is the accumulated result of wartime priorities, institutional convenience, the absence of famous names, and the simple bad luck of sinking in the wrong year and in the wrong context for the story to catch hold of the public imagination. What the Britannic deserved, and what it has only partially received in the century since its sinking, is a proper reckoning. Not in the sense of assigning blame, though the propeller deaths do raise questions that were never fully answered, but in the sense of honest examination of what the ship was, what it was doing, what caused the explosion, whether it was carrying what it was supposed to be carrying, and what the decisions made in those 55 minutes actually cost. The story has the pieces for that reckoning. The wreck exists. The records, incomplete as they are, exist. The survivor accounts exist. The German naval records, such as they are, exist. What has been missing for most of the past century is the sustained institutional will to put them together carefully and arrive at something more complete than the brief inquiry of 1916 managed to produce. That gap between what happened and what was officially acknowledged is where the Britannic story lives, and it is why the story has not been fully put to rest. It is not a gap created by mystery alone. It is a gap created by the specific conditions of wartime, by the particular indifference of institutions that had larger things to worry about, and by the way that some questions, once left unanswered long enough, become harder and harder to close. The wreck rests in the Aegean, on its starboard side, in 120 metres of cold water, holding whatever it holds, and the questions that were not asked in 1916 are still, more than a century later, waiting for something like a proper answer. What remains, then, is not just a historical puzzle. It is a reflection of how disasters are processed, remembered and forgotten. and of what gets preserved when history is written in a hurry. The Britannic was never given the time or attention it deserved, and the story that has come down to us is incomplete as a result. But incomplete is not the same as closed, and the threads that remain open, the mine and the torpedo, the munitions question, the propeller deaths, the brief inquiry, the long forgetting, are all still there, still pulling gently at anyone willing to follow them. Which brings us finally to the question of what the Britannic story actually means when you step back from the specific details and look at the whole shape of it. The whole shape of it, when you hold it at a distance, is a shape made of gaps. Not dramatic gaps, not conspiratorial ones, just the ordinary gaps that form when something complicated happens in a hurry, during a war, far from home, and the people who might have asked the right questions were too busy or too tired or simply not paying attention. The Britannic was a ship that never got to be what it was built for. That is perhaps the simplest and most honest way to put it. It was designed to carry passengers across the North Atlantic, to move wealthy travellers in comfort between Southampton and New York, to complete the trio that White Star Line had imagined as the most impressive fleet of ocean liners the world had ever seen. It was fitted instead with hospital beds. It was painted white and given red crosses. It was sent into a war zone doing work that was necessary and unglamorous, and entirely different from anything its designers had envisioned when they laid its keel in Belfast in 1911. There is something quietly melancholy about that, if you let yourself think about it. The Titanic at least sailed as a passenger ship. It got to be, however briefly, the thing it was meant to be. The Britannic never did. It went from the shipyard to the war without a single paying passenger ever walking its corridors, without a single ordinary voyage, without the chance to prove whether all the post-Titanic safety improvements would have made any practical difference under normal conditions. The double hull, the redesigned watertight compartments, the gantry davit system with its 48 lifeboats, all of it was incorporated and then never tested in the way it was intended to be tested. When it finally was tested on the morning of November the 21st, 1916, the ship sank in 55 minutes, which is faster than the Titanic, and which is still, more than a century later, not fully explained. The mine theory remains the most widely accepted explanation. U-73, commanded by Gustav C.S., laid a minefield in the Kea Channel in late October 1916. Other ships were lost in the same area around the same time, the Burdigala on November 14th, the Braemar Castle on November 23rd. The pattern is consistent. The physical evidence from the wreck, such as it is, does not rule out a mine strike. The official inquiry concluded it was a mine, and most maritime historians working on the subject today agree. That is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot. But the torpedo theory has never been fully dismissed either. The speed and spread of the flooding struck some researchers as more consistent with a torpedo than with a contact mine of that era. The bow section of the wreck, which is the part that would tell the clearest story, is damaged and partially buried in sediment, which makes forensic analysis from the outside difficult and inconclusive. The German naval records for U-73 do not contain a confirmed torpedo attack on the Britannic, but wartime records are not always complete, and the absence of a record is not the same as proof that something did not happen. And then there is the munitions question, which is the most uncomfortable part of the story and the part that has never been officially addressed. If the Britannic was carrying war materials in its holds, it would not have been entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention. It would have been, legally speaking, a legitimate military target. Whether that is what it was is a question that the 1916 inquiry did not ask seriously, and that the British government has never formally answered. Simon Mills, who purchased the wreck, writes in 1996 and has spent years studying the ship's history, has examined the question carefully and found no confirmed physical evidence of munitions in the wreck. The survivor accounts do not describe the kind of secondary explosion that would be expected if a large quantity of ammunition had been stored aboard. The casualty figures, 30 dead out of more than 1,000 people, suggest a sinking that, however fast, did not involve a catastrophic internal explosion beyond the initial event. None of that is definitive. The wreck has not been fully excavated. The cargo hold interiors have not been systematically examined. The British wartime records that might settle the question are incomplete, and some were classified for decades. The munitions question exists in the same permanent suspension as the mine versus torpedo debate. Not confirmed, not definitively ruled out, still pulling at researchers who look closely at the story. What you're left with, when you lay all of this out, is a disaster whose cause is probably known but not proven beyond dispute, whose circumstances were shaped by a series of decisions that seemed reasonable in the moment and look more complicated in retrospect, and whose 30 dead were never given the kind of careful public accounting that the scale of the sinking might have warranted. The portholes and gangway doors left open for ventilation, standard practice on a hospital ship in warm weather, accelerated the flooding in ways that the ship's designers had not anticipated, and that the crew could not reverse quickly enough once the explosion occurred. Captain Bartlett's decision to keep the engines running and try to beach the ship on Kia Island was a reasonable decision, possibly the right decision, but it also meant that the propellers were still turning when 2 lifeboats were lowered prematurely on the starboard side. Around 30 people were pulled into those propellers. That is most of the total death toll. Those deaths were not inevitable. They were the result of a communication breakdown in the worst possible minutes, of the gap between the design of a new lifeboat davit system and the reality of using it on a ship that was already listing and sinking fast. The remarkable thing, the thing that tends to get lost in the discussion of causes and controversies, is that more than 1,000 people survived. In 55 minutes, in the middle of the Aegean Sea, with 2 lifeboats destroyed and the ship going down faster than the Titanic, more than 1,000 people got off alive. That is an extraordinary outcome. It is the result of the improved safety design, of the lifeboat capacity, of the relatively calm sea conditions that morning, of the rescue ships that arrived within a few hours, and of the discipline and competence of most of the crew during the evacuation. The Britannic story is, in one reading, a story of a disaster that was contained. 30 deaths is 30 deaths too many, and the propeller incident is a specific and painful failure, but against the backdrop of what the Titanic sinking cost, and against the scale of the losses that the First World War was producing every single day in 1916, the survival of more than 1,000 people from a ship that sank in under an hour is something worth acknowledging clearly. Violet Jessop acknowledged it. She jumped into the Aegean that morning, was briefly pulled under by the suction of the sinking ship, surfaced, and was eventually pulled into a lifeboat. She had been aboard the Olympic when it collided with HMS Hawke in 1911. She had been in Lifeboat 16 when the Titanic went down in 1912. She survived the Britannic in 1916. She lived until 1971, and her memoir, published after her death, is one of the most direct human accounts of what those 55 minutes felt like from the inside. She described the explosion, the tilt of the ship, the chaos around the lifeboats, the sound of the propellers. She described it with the particular clarity of someone who had already survived 2 disasters and knew, better than almost anyone else on board, what was happening and what needed to be done. She's sometimes called Miss Unsinkable, which is a name that fits her remarkable record but perhaps undersells her. She was not just lucky, she was observant, capable, and calm under conditions that would have broken most people. Her account of the Britannic is one of the few survivor testimonies that has been preserved and studied in any detail, and it matters because it provides a human texture to a sinking that has otherwise been filtered almost entirely through official records and technical analysis. The wreck itself rests on its starboard side in approximately 120 metres of Aegean water, a few miles off the coast of Kia. It was found by Jacques Cousteau in 1975, and subsequent expeditions by Robert Ballard in 1995 and others have mapped it in increasing detail. It is by most accounts better preserved than the Titanic, which lies at nearly 3,800 metres depth and has been subject to decades of more aggressive deterioration. The Britannic's shallower resting place has allowed technical divers to reach it and document it, though 120 metres is still well beyond recreational diving limits. The open portholes that Cousteau's team observed are still there, physical evidence of the ventilation practice that contributed to the flooding. The red crosses, or their traces, have been reported by divers, though the paint has faded considerably over more than a century of immersion. The ship is enormous at that depth, a long dark mass lying on its side, its scale still apparent, still somehow suggesting what it was meant to be. It is a war grave under Greek law, which means that salvage operations are restricted and that the wreck has a degree of legal protection. That protection matters, not just for the 30 people who died and whose remains may still be somewhere in the wreck, but for the integrity of the site as a source of historical evidence. Future technology, better remotely operated vehicles, more sophisticated imaging, improved methods of non-invasive examination may eventually allow researchers to answer some of the questions that cannot currently be answered without disturbing the site. The bow section, which holds the most direct evidence about the nature and location of the explosion, might be more carefully examined. The cargo hold interiors might be mapped in ways that could finally address the munitions question. None of that is imminent, but none of it is impossible either. What the Britannic represents beyond its specific historical details is something worth sitting with quietly. It is a ship that was built in the shadow of one disaster, incorporated every lesson that disaster had to teach, and then sank anyway, under different circumstances in a different sea, for reasons that are still not entirely settled. It is a reminder that preparation and design can reduce risk but cannot eliminate it, that the conditions of any given disaster are always at least partly specific and unpredictable, and that the lessons learned from one catastrophe do not always transfer cleanly to the next one. The double hull did not save the Britannic. The additional watertight compartments did not save the Britannic. The improved lifeboat system saved most of the people aboard, but the system also contributed, in the specific chaos of those 55 minutes, to the deaths of around 30 of them. Preparation matters, design matters, and circumstances still find ways to confound both. There are 30 names attached to the Britannic's sinking, and most of them are not widely known. They were crew members, medical staff, people doing ordinary and necessary work on a ship that was trying to do something useful in the middle of a terrible war. The effort to recover their individual stories, to give them the kind of specific acknowledgement that the scale and speed of the disaster denied them at the time, is ongoing and incomplete. They deserve better than a number in a footnote, and the centenary coverage of 2016 made some progress in that direction, though not as much as might have been hoped. History tends to remember disasters through their most dramatic elements, their famous survivors, their most debated questions, their most striking images. The people who simply did not make it are harder to hold on to, and the Britannic's 30 are no exception. The Aegean is a particular kind of sea. It is old and warm and full of history in ways that most bodies of water are not. Ancient trade routes ran through it. Battles were fought on it. Civilizations built their ports along its edges and watched their ships disappear over its horizon. The key channel, where the Britannic sank, is a quiet stretch of water most of the time, the kind of place that looks entirely unremarkable from the surface, blue and calm and ordinary. Below the surface, at 120 metres, the ship is still there, exactly as it settled in November 1916, tilted on its side, enormous, silent, slowly being reclaimed by the sea in the way that all things eventually are. There is something in that image worth holding on to as this story comes to a close. Not the drama of the sinking, not the debates about mines and torpedoes and munitions, not the inquiry and the forgetting and the long, slow recovery of the story's details. Just the ship itself resting in the Aegean, in water that has been there far longer than the ship, and will be there long after the last of its steel has dissolved. It went to war instead of the sea lanes. It sank before it could be what it was built to be. It carried more than 1,000 people to safety and 30 people to their deaths in 55 minutes on a November morning in 1916 in a channel that most people have never heard of. The questions that remain open may eventually be answered. Future expeditions will map the wreck more precisely. Future researchers may find documents that have not yet been examined. The technology for non-invasive analysis of submerged structures continues to improve, and what cannot be determined today from the outside of the bow section may become determinable in 10 or 20 years. The Britannic is not a closed book. It is a book that was written in a hurry during a war by people who had other things to worry about, and it is still being read carefully by the people willing to go back to it. What it asks of us in the end is not certainty. It asks for the kind of attention that was not given to it in 1916, the slow and careful kind. The kind that doesn't need a dramatic answer to feel worthwhile. It asks to be remembered as more than a footnote to the Titanic, more than a curiosity, more than a historical puzzle. It was a ship. It was full of people. It sank in under an hour. 30 of them did not come home. And the sea, as it always does, kept everything else. If this story found you somewhere quiet tonight, and if following it felt like time well spent, a like or a subscription to Life Beyond Scene means more than you might think. It helps this kind of careful, unhurried storytelling reach the people who are looking for it. For now, the Aegean is still. The wreck is where it has always been. And wherever you are listening from tonight, I hope the night is soft, and the questions you are carrying feel a little lighter than they did before. Sleep well.